Welcome to Whispering Willow's Sleep, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and, if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe will help me make more nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The frost-etched delicate patterns across the window panes of 220 Warby Baker Street, transforming ordinary glass into crystalline artwork that glowed softly in the amber gaslight. Outside, the gentle hiss and crackle of coal fires mingled with the muffled clip-clop of hooves against snow-covered cobblestones. Dr. John Watson pressed his fingertips against the cold glass, feeling the slight vibration of London continuing its winter rhythm beyond the warm confines of their lodgings. Something peculiar caught his attention. The absence of fog that typically shrouded the city this time of year. The sky above was startlingly clear, revealing a canvas of stars uncommonly visible in London's night, and somehow making the December air feel even colder than the thermometer suggested. "Holmes," Watson said quietly, his breath creating a small cloud against the window. "I cannot recall a winter this severe in all my years in London." Sherlock Holmes sat in his favoured armchair by the fire, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed in what might appear to be restful contemplation to those unfamiliar with his habits. But Watson knew better. The detective's mind was never truly at rest, merely shifting between different modes of awareness. "Indeed, Watson," Holmes replied without opening his eyes. "The Thames will freeze tonight." Watson turned from the window, eyebrows raised. "Surely not. It hasn't frozen solid since 1814, Holmes supplied, finally opening his eyes. The last great frost fair. Though there were minor freezes in the 1830s, nothing substantial enough for what I suspect we shall witness by tomorrow noon." The doctor returned to his own chair across from Holmes, reaching for the teapot that Mrs. Hudson had left, warming by the fire. The familiar ritual of pouring tea, watching the amber liquid stream into the delicate china cups, the rising wisps of fragrant steam, the soft clink of silver against porcelain, provided a momentary anchor of normalcy against Holmes's remarkable prediction. "And how, pray tell, have you deduced this meteorological certainty?" Watson asked, passing a cup to his friend. "Have you taken up the study of weather forecasting alongside your expertise in tobacco ash and footprints?" Holmes's lips curved into the ghost of a smile as he accepted the tea. "Nothing so ambitious, my dear Watson. Merely a telegram from my brother Mycroft this morning. The government has been monitoring the temperature patterns with some concern. The Thames has been inching toward freezing for 3 days now, with each night bringing the temperature lower. Tonight's clear sky will allow what little heat remains to escape completely." Holmes rose from his chair with unexpected swiftness and moved to retrieve a leather-bound volume from the bookshelf. The spine crackled softly as he opened it, the sound of seldom disturbed pages finally given attention. The fire popped and hissed behind him, as if in appreciative response to this sudden activity. "Here," he said, turning the book toward Watson. "An account of the Frost Fair of 1814. Quite the spectacle by all reports. Streets of tents upon the ice, printing presses, drinking establishments, even an elephant led across at Blackfriars Bridge as a demonstration of the ice's strength." Watson leaned forward, genuinely intrigued, the warmth of the teacup pleasant against his palms as he studied the detailed illustrations. The faded ink depicted scenes of merriment upon a frozen river, crowds of people seemingly dancing upon water, smoke rising from temporary structures built atop the solid Thames, all rendered with the slightly exaggerated flair typical of early 19th century prints. "Remarkable," Watson murmured, "though I imagine the Thames is different now, with the embankments and the reduced tide flow from the new bridge construction. Surely it cannot freeze as it once did." "Different, yes," Holmes agreed, reclaiming his seat and stretching his long legs toward the fire. "But not impossible under the right conditions. And these conditions, Watson, are precisely right." As if to emphasize Holmes's point, a particularly strong gust of wind rattled the windows, sending the flames in the hearth dancing. The comfortable room suddenly felt more precious in contrast to the bitter cold beyond its walls. Watson found himself thinking of those less fortunate, huddled in London's meaner streets without the luxury of coal fires and thick blankets. "I confess," Watson said after a thoughtful sip of tea, "a frost fair would be something to witness, a page of history repeating itself after 80 years. Holmes regarded him with that particular gleam in his eye that Watson had come to recognize as the harbinger of an adventure. "Then we shall witness it together, old friend, though if the Thames indeed freezes, as I expect, history may not be all that awaits us upon the ice." "What do you mean?" Watson asked, immediately alert to the subtle change in Holmes's tone. "This," Holmes replied, reaching into his waistcoat to produce a folded piece of paper. "Delivered by a most peculiar messenger this morning while you were attending to Mrs. Forrester's influenza." Watson accepted the paper, noting its quality. Expensive, but not ostentatious, slightly scented with what might be lavender or perhaps violet. The handwriting was elegant, flowing across the page like dark water. "Mr. Holmes, when midnight strikes upon the frozen Thames, look for the one who leaves no footprints. The frost-fair phantom glides where others stumble, takes what cannot be missed, and vanishes like breath in winter air. 3 nights hence, something precious will disappear unless you intervene. I would engage your services, but how does one hire a detective to catch a ghost?" And concerned observer Watson read the note twice, feeling the pleasant drowsiness of the warm fire and tea giving way to familiar curiosity. "Anonymous," he observed, "and deliberately mysterious. Do you consider it genuine, or someone's idea of amusement?" Holmes reclaimed the note, holding it briefly to his nose before returning it to his pocket. "The paper is from Harrington's on Bond Street. The ink contains a higher than usual amount of iron gall, distinctive but not unique. The scent is violet, not lavender, and specifically Parma violet, suggesting a person of means but not excessive wealth. As to whether our correspondent truly believes in phantoms," Holmes shrugged, the gesture unusually expressive for him, "that remains to be seen. What interests me more is the timing. You think they knew the Thames would freeze? I think, Watson, that someone has been planning something contingent upon this rare natural phenomenon, and another, someone has caught wind of it." Holmes rose again, moving to the window where Watson had stood earlier. "The Thames freezing creates unique opportunities, a temporary landscape where the usual rules of movement and access are suspended, where normal boundaries disappear." The firelight caught Holmes's profile as he gazed out at the night, transforming him momentarily into something like an etching himself. all sharp angles and deep shadows against the frosted glass. Outside, the last snowflakes of the evening drifted past the window, each one briefly illuminated by the gaslight before disappearing into the darkness. "We should retire early tonight, Watson," Holmes said without turning from the window. "Tomorrow promises to be most instructive." Morning arrived with a quality of light that immediately struck Watson as unusual when he drew back the curtains. The typical London grey had been replaced by a crystalline brightness that reflected off every snow-covered surface. The air itself seemed different, sharper, clearer, carrying sounds with unusual precision. He could hear conversations from the street below with perfect clarity, each voice distinct against the background of hooves and wheels. After a hasty breakfast, Holmes and Watson found themselves in a hansom cab heading toward the river. The streets were busier than typical for such a cold morning, with people moving purposefully in the same general direction. News of the frozen Thames had clearly spread through London overnight, carried by whatever mysterious currents transmitted information through a great city before newspapers could print the words. "Look at them, Holmes," Watson remarked. "Like pilgrims to a shrine." Holmes nodded, his breath fogging in the cab's unheated interior. The collective memory of London is longer than one might expect. Stories of frost fairs have been passed down through generations, a rare wonder in an age that prides itself on having catalogued all wonders. Their cab could approach only within 3 streets of the Thames, as the closer roads had become impassably crowded. Holmes paid the driver, and they joined the steady stream of Londoners making their way toward the river on foot. The atmosphere was unusual, a peculiar blend of excitement and reverence. Watson noted faces alight with anticipation, children skipping ahead of parents, even the typically reserved gentlemen of the city abandoning some of their customary decorum in their haste. The first view of the Thames came suddenly as they crested a small rise near Blackfriars. The sight drew an involuntary gasp from Watson and a rare murmur of appreciation from Holmes. The river had transformed overnight into a vast white plain, stretching from bank to bank. The early morning sun caught every crystal of ice, creating a glittering expanse that seemed almost blinding in its intensity. Already a few brave souls had ventured onto the solid surface, their dark figures creating stark silhouettes against the white. "Remarkable," Watson breathed, the word forming a small cloud that dissipated slowly in the still air. "Indeed," Holmes agreed, his keen eyes surveying not just the frozen river, but the gathering crowds along the embankments. "And see how quickly humanity adapts to the miraculous. Already, there are vendors setting up stalls." It was true. Even as they watched, enterprising Londoners were establishing a makeshift market along the river's edge. Tables appeared laden with steaming beverages, roasted chestnuts, and meat pies. A man was setting up a stand offering skate rentals, his breath puffing in rhythmic clouds as he arranged his wares. The scene was transforming before their eyes from a natural phenomenon into a spontaneous festival. Holmes and Watson made their way down to the embankment, where stone steps now served as an improvised entrance to this unexpected ice kingdom. Civil authorities were present, but seemed mostly concerned with ensuring that the access points didn't become dangerously overcrowded, rather than preventing people from venturing onto the ice. "The authorities have checked the thickness," Holmes observed, nodding toward a group of official-looking men with measuring tools. "They've deemed it safe, at least near the banks, A frost fair will indeed be upon us by afternoon. A police constable nearby overheard Holmes's comment and touched his hat respectfully, recognizing the detective. "That's right, Mr. Holmes. 16 inches thick by the south bank, sir. A remarkable thing. The commissioner issued guidelines, no more than 50 yards from shore today until further. Measurements can be taken of the center channel." "Very sensible," Holmes replied. "Tell me, Constable, have you been assigned to patrol the ice?" The constable looked momentarily uncomfortable. "In a manner of speaking, sir, though I can't say I'm looking forward to it. Slippery business, this ice patrol. Half the force can barely stand upright out there." Holmes smiled slightly. "I imagine pursuit of a fleeing suspect would prove challenging under such conditions." "Nearly impossible, Mr. Holmes," the constable agreed. "A man who knows how to move on ice would have every advantage over us." Watson watched a thoughtful expression cross Holmes's face, the same expression he wore when a puzzle piece had just fallen into place. Before he could inquire, Holmes had thanked the constable and was guiding Watson toward the ice steps with a gentle pressure on his elbow. "Carefully now, Watson," Holmes advised, as they took their first steps onto the frozen Thames. "Small steps, weight evenly distributed." The sensation was extraordinary. The solid surface beneath their feet, both unmistakably stable, yet somehow fundamentally wrong. This was the Thames, which Watson had seen churning with currents and carrying ships daily for years, now transformed into something that could be walked upon. The ice creaked occasionally, not alarmingly, but with a deep, resonant sound that seemed to rise from far below, as if the river itself was merely sleeping, and might stir at any moment. The air over the ice was noticeably colder than on the embankment, and Watson pulled his scarf tighter around his neck. Their breath formed perfect clouds that hung in the still air momentarily before dissolving. Around them, Londoners were discovering the unique properties of this new terrain, some sliding cautiously in their boots, others already gliding with surprising grace on skates. Holmes moved with characteristic adaptability, quickly adjusting his gait to the slippery surface. His eyes, however, were not on his feet, but scanning the growing crowd and the expansive white field that stretched before them. "Are you looking for something in particular, Holmes?" Watson asked, having to concentrate somewhat on maintaining his own balance. "I'm looking for everything, Watson," Holmes replied with a small smile. "But specifically, I am attempting to imagine how one might appear to leave no footprints on a surface where everyone must inevitably leave some mark of passage." Watson glanced down at their feet, where their boots had already left distinct impressions in the light dusting of snow that covered parts of the ice. "A reference to the phantom in the note, I suppose. But surely that's merely poetic language." "Perhaps," Holmes conceded. "Though sometimes, Watson, poetic language conceals precise technical truth. Shall we continue our exploration? I believe a full circuit of the accessible ice would be instructive." They spent the morning walking the perimeter of what was rapidly becoming a true frost fair. With each hour, more structures appeared, first simple tables, then canvas awnings, and finally more substantial wooden booths. The scents of roasting food and mulled wine began to fill the air, competing with the crisp coldness. Music started as isolated street performers with fiddles or hurdy-gurdies, then gradually coalesced into small bands competing for the attention and coins of the growing crowd. By noon, Holmes and Watson found themselves in what felt like a small village that had materialized on the frozen river as if by magic. Holmes purchased hot cider for them both from a red-faced vendor, whose breath smelled suspiciously of stronger spirits than what he was selling. "I've heard whispers already," Holmes murmured as they sipped the warming drinks, "of something strange seen on the ice last night. A figure moving with unnatural speed, leaving no trace." Watson raised an eyebrow. "The phantom of the note, before you even received it?" "Indeed, which suggests our anonymous correspondent was reporting something already witnessed, not predicting something yet to come." A commotion near the centre of the fair interrupted their conversation. Cheers and applause rising above the general hum of the crowd. Making their way toward the sound, they found a small circle had formed around a skater, performing elaborate figures on the ice. The man moved with extraordinary grace, his skates barely seeming to touch the surface as he spun and leaped. "Magnificent control," Holmes commented, watching the performance with analytical eyes. "Note how he shifts his weight, Watson. There is science in this art." As the skater finished with a particularly dramatic spin, Holmes's attention shifted suddenly to a tall, elegantly dressed woman standing at the edge of the circle of spectators. Her face was partially obscured by a fur-trimmed hood, but her posture suggested tension rather than enjoyment of the performance. "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "She's watching the crowd, not the skater." Before Watson could respond, the woman seemed to sense Holmes's scrutiny. She turned slightly, revealing a striking profile with high cheekbones and a proud nose, before melting back into the crowd with remarkable swiftness for someone navigating ice in heeled boots. "Holmes, who was—" Watson began. But Holmes was already moving, following the woman's path with his characteristic determination when on a scent. Watson hurried after him, nearly losing his footing in his haste. By the time they reached the spot where the woman had disappeared, there was no sign of her among the shifting mass of fairgoers. Holmes stood still, his keen eyes scanning the crowd, before slowly relaxing his posture. "Gone," he said simply, "but we shall see her again, I think." "You recognized her?" Watson asked. "No," Holmes replied, "but she recognized me, and that is far more interesting." The day continued to unfold around them as the Frost Fair grew more elaborate with each passing hour. By late afternoon, Holmes and Watson had completed a thorough survey of the ice-bound celebration, partaken of various foods and drinks to maintain the appearance of casual visitors, and overheard countless conversations, most mundane, some intriguing. As the winter sun began its early descent, casting long blue shadows across the ice, Holmes finally suggested they return to Baker Street. "But the phantom," Watson protested mildly. "Shouldn't we remain to see if it appears at midnight?" Holmes smiled, the expression barely visible in the fading light. "Oh, we shall return well before midnight, Watson. But first, we need proper equipment if we're to move effectively on this new terrain. And I need time to send several telegrams. Our Frost Fair phantom may leave no footprints, but I suspect they leave other traces, ones that might be revealed with the right preparation." As they made their way back across the ice toward the embankment, the first lamps were being lit around the fair, creating golden pools of light that reflected off the frozen surface. The Thames had transformed from a glittering white expanse to something more magical and mysterious, a dark mirror studded with stars of gaslight, where shadows moved in curious ways and sounds carried with deceptive clarity. "Holmes," Watson said quietly as they reached the stone steps leading back to solid London, "what do you make of all this?" Holmes paused, looking back at the scene one last time before they ascended. "I think, Watson, that we are looking at both an opportunity and a stage. Someone has been waiting for this rare convergence of conditions. The frozen Thames offers possibilities that exist at no other time, for celebration, certainly, but also for other, perhaps less innocent activities." "And the phantom?" Holmes's eyes reflected the distant lamps as he turned back to Watson. "Every good performance needs its mystery, my friend. And we, I believe, have been invited to be the audience." With that cryptic statement, Holmes led the way up the steps, back into the familiar streets of London, which somehow felt utterly changed, now that the river at the city's heart had transformed into something ancient and new all at once. The adventure of the Frost-Fair Phantom had truly begun. The late afternoon light had nearly faded by the time Holmes and Watson returned to their lodgings at Baker Street. The familiar rooms felt especially welcoming after hours spent in the bitter cold, though Watson noticed that Holmes showed none of the physical relief he himself felt at being back in the warmth. The detective moved with the same restless energy that had carried him across the ice, immediately setting about various preparations, while Watson gratefully sank into his armchair. "I've sent word to my network of informants to gather any unusual reports from the riverside last night," Holmes explained as he sorted through a stack of telegrams that had arrived during their absence. "Ah, and here we have something of interest already." He held up a yellow telegram form, the thin paper crinkling softly between his long fingers. The fire crackled in the grate, casting dancing shadows across Holmes's sharp features as he read the message aloud. "Reports of missing items from 3 vendors near Blackfriars last night. Nothing valuable. Food, ribbons, a small mirror. No signs of forced entry to stalls. Police dismissive. Vendors claim supernatural theft." Holmes set the telegram aside with a satisfied nod. "The game reveals itself, Watson. Petty theft hardly seems worth the attention of Sherlock Holmes," Watson observed, warming his hands by the fire, "especially given the rather melodramatic note about phantoms. It is not the value of the stolen items that interests me," Holmes replied, rifling through a large wooden chest he had pulled from beneath his bed, "but rather the method of their taking and the curious selection. Why those particular items, and how were they removed without disturbing the stalls?" Before Watson could respond, Holmes exclaimed triumphantly and extracted 2 pairs of curious-looking boots from the depths of the chest. They were leather, well made but clearly aged, with metal blades affixed to their soles. "Ice skates," Watson exclaimed with some surprise. "I didn't know you possessed such things, Holmes." "There are few physical activities I haven't studied at some point, Watson," Holmes replied, with a hint of amusement. "These are Dutch in design, far superior to the English varieties being rented at the fair. The blade extends further, at both toe and heel, allowing for greater control and speed." He handed 1 pair to Watson, who examined them with interest. The leather was supple despite its age, and the blades, though showing signs of past use, had been recently sharpened to a gleaming edge. "I haven't skated since I was a boy," Watson admitted, turning the skate over in his hands, "and never on anything like these." "You'll adapt quickly enough," Holmes assured him. "Your sense of balance is excellent, despite your old wound, and these will prove essential for our midnight excursion. A man on skates can cover the frozen Thames with remarkable efficiency, compared to one slipping about in ordinary boots. Watson nodded, seeing the logic. And if this phantom of yours is indeed using the ice to advantage, we'll need equal mobility. Precisely, Holmes replied, setting aside his own pair of skates and moving to his desk, where he began scribbling a series of notes. Now, I suggest you rest while you can, Watson. We'll take dinner at 7 and return to the Thames by 10. The fair will still be active, but beginning to quiet. Perfect conditions for our observation. True to Holmes's prediction, when they returned to the Thames that evening, the Frost Fair had evolved into something even more remarkable than its daylight incarnation. Hundreds of lanterns and torches illuminated the ice, their light reflecting and multiplying until the entire frozen river seemed to glow from within. The crowd had thinned somewhat from the afternoon peak, but remained substantial, though its character had changed. Families with children had largely departed, replaced by groups of young people and couples taking advantage of the romantic setting. Holmes and Watson made their way carefully down the stone steps to the ice, each carrying a small bag containing their skates. They chose a quiet spot near the embankment to change their footwear, giving Holmes an opportunity to survey the scene before venturing further onto the frozen river. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured as he laced his skates with practiced movements. "Observe how the fair has organized itself, Watson. Not randomly, but according to an organic logic. Food vendors cluster near the bank for easy resupply, entertainments towards the center, where space allows for audiences, and there," he pointed toward a collection of small structures near the opposite shore, "the more questionable establishments, drinking tents and makeshift gambling halls, I'd wager." Watson followed Holmes's gaze, noting how the different areas of the fair were indeed arranged with a certain natural order, despite having sprung up spontaneously over the course of a single day. The Thames had been temporarily transformed into a small city with its own districts and character. "It's like London itself in miniature," Watson observed, standing cautiously on his newly attached skates, complete with its respectable and less respectable quarters. "Yes, and like London, secrets thrive in its shadows." Holmes rose effortlessly on his skates, his tall figure suddenly even more imposing. "Shall we begin our patrol?" Watson took his first tentative strokes, finding that his body remembered the motions from childhood better than he had expected. The sensation was extraordinary, a smooth, gliding movement that seemed to require far less effort than walking once the initial balance was achieved. Holmes moved beside him with the casual grace of someone who had mastered the skill long ago, matching his pace to Watson's more careful progress. They made a wide circuit of the fair, Holmes occasionally adjusting their course to pass particular stalls or to observe specific groups of revellers. The night air had grown even colder, but Watson found that the exertion of skating kept him comfortably warm. Their breath formed perfect plumes of vapour that trailed behind them like spirits as they glided across the ice. "I suggest we begin by interviewing the vendors who reported thefts," Holmes said, as they approached the cluster of stalls near Blackfriars Bridge. "Their experiences may provide the pattern we seek." The first vendor was a ruddy-faced man selling hot chestnuts and baked potatoes from a copper brazier that radiated welcome heat. His name was Tolliver, and he greeted Holmes's inquiries as whole. Initial suspicion that quickly melted into enthusiasm when he realized who was asking. "Mr. Holmes himself, taking an interest in my missing goods," he exclaimed, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of East London. "Not that there was much to take, mind you. 2 bags of my finest chestnuts and a pound of sugar for roasting them. But it's the how of it that's got me puzzled, sir." "Explain," Holmes prompted, accepting a paper cone of hot chestnuts that Tolliver insisted on providing at no charge. "Well, sir, I closed up proper last night. First night of the fair and all. Wrapped my goods in canvas, weighted down the corners with stones against the wind. This morning the canvas was still in place, stones unmoved, but the chestnuts and sugar were gone, like they'd vanished into thin air." Tolliver spread his hands in a gesture of bafflement. "The constable said it must have been the wind, or that I miscounted my stock, but I've been in this trade 30 years, Mr. Holmes. I know what I had and what I didn't." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, passing a chestnut to Watson before popping one into his own mouth. "And you saw nothing unusual, heard nothing during the night?" "I wasn't here at night, sir. Went home to Lambeth like any sensible man. Though—" Tolliver leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Young Tim, who helps at the skate rental, said he saw something strange when he came to check on the stalls before dawn. Said there was a figure moving across the ice faster than any man should, leaving no marks behind. When he called out, it disappeared like morning mist." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "And where might we find this observant Tim?" Tolliver pointed toward a small wooden structure near the centre of the fair. "Skate rental, over yonder. Mind, he's a fanciful lad. Reads too many of those penny dreadfuls, if you ask me." Holmes thanked the vendor, and they continued their circuit of the fair, speaking to the other 2 merchants who had reported missing items. The pattern was consistent: small, seemingly insignificant thefts occurring without any signs of forced entry or disturbance. One woman selling ribbons and small trinkets had lost only a hand mirror and a length of scarlet silk. A baker had lost a dozen mince pies, but nothing else from his considerable stock. "Curious selections," Watson remarked as they glided away from the baker's stall. "Food, adornments, a mirror. What do you make of it, Holmes?" "I'm forming a theory," Holmes replied, "but I need more data. Let us find this Tim and hear his account of the phantom directly." The skate rental was doing a brisk business despite the late hour, with a line of customers waiting to exchange their normal footwear for blades. Holmes and Watson waited patiently until the rush subsided before approaching the counter, behind which stood a lanky youth with a shock of ginger hair escaping from beneath a woolen cap. "Tim, I presume?" Holmes inquired. "My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. I understand you witnessed something unusual on the ice early this morning." The young man's eyes widened with recognition, and he glanced nervously around before leaning across the counter. "Mr. Holmes?" "Yes, sir, I did, though the constable told me I was seeing things. Said it was just the fog playing tricks." "Tell me exactly what you observed," Holmes encouraged, his tone gentle but insistent. "Every detail matters." Tim took a deep breath, clearly eager to share his story with someone who wouldn't dismiss it. "I came down early, sir, just before dawn. Mr. Parker, who runs this stand, pays me extra to check that no one tampered with the skates overnight. It was still dark, with just a bit of grey beginning in the east. The fair was empty, as quiet as a churchyard." The boy paused, his eyes taking on a distant look as he recalled the scene. That's when I saw it, sir. Out in the middle of the Thames, where the ice is thickest. A figure, moving like nothing I've ever seen before. Not running, not walking, but gliding faster than a man should be able to move. It seemed to flow across the ice, leaving no tracks that I could see. Could you describe the figure? Holmes asked. Height, build, clothing? Tim frowned in concentration. Tall, I think, though it's hard to be certain at that distance and light, wearing something dark that seemed to billow out behind it. I couldn't make out a face. It seemed almost covered, or hidden somehow. And what did this figure do? Watson prompted, when the boy fell silent. It moved toward the shore, near where the vendors have their stalls. I called out, "Stupid, I know," but I was startled. And it stopped, just stopped, dead still. Then, Tim swallowed, lowering his voice further. Then it turned toward me, sir, though I couldn't see its face. And it seemed to bow, like it was putting on a show. Next thing I knew, there was a sort of mist or smoke, and when it cleared, the figure was gone. Holmes nodded slowly, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Thank you, Tim. You've been most helpful. One last question. Have you noticed anyone at the fair today with unusual skill on the ice? Someone whose abilities stand out from the typical pleasure skater? Tim considered the question. Well, there's been that fancy gentleman giving demonstrations. Continental-style skating, he calls it. Draws quite a crowd. And there's a few of the Thames watermen who've taken to the ice like they were born to it. Oh, and that foreign lady with the silver skates. Moves like she's dancing, she does. Foreign lady? Holmes asked, his interest clearly piqued. Yes, sir. A tall woman speaks with an accent. Russian, maybe? She was here earlier, doing all sorts of spins and jumps that had people clapping. Haven't seen her for a few hours, though. Holmes thanked the young man, pressing a coin into his hand before guiding Watson away from the rental stand. They glided in silence for several minutes, moving toward the center of the fair, where the ice was smoother and less crowded. The woman you noticed earlier, Watson suggested. The one who seemed to recognize you and then disappeared? Possibly, Holmes acknowledged, though it would be premature to draw conclusions. What we have are disconnected observations, missing items of minimal value, reports of a mysterious figure on the ice, and several individuals with exceptional skating ability. They had reached a relatively quiet area, and Holmes came to a stop, turning slowly in place to survey the entire fair. The sight was truly remarkable, a miniature city of light spread across the frozen Thames, surrounded by the dark silhouette of London proper. Music drifted from several locations, creating a curiously overlapping melody, while the hum of voices provided a constant background. It's quite beautiful, isn't it? Watson remarked, following Holmes's gaze. Like something from another time. Indeed, Holmes agreed, his expression softening momentarily. The Frost Fair is a window into London's past, a temporary return to an older rhythm of life. Perhaps that's why it inspires such fascination and opportunism. Their contemplative moment was interrupted by a sudden shift in the crowd nearby. People were gathering, their attention drawn to a small clearing on the ice where a man stood preparing to perform. He wore an elaborate costume of deep blue, trimmed with silver, clearly designed to catch the eye and glitter in the lamplight. "Ah," Holmes murmured. "Let's observe this demonstration, Watson. I believe this may be the fancy gentleman Tim mentioned." They joined the forming circle of spectators just as the performer began. He was indeed skilled, executing complex figures and turns with apparent effortlessness. His skates barely seemed to touch the ice as he glided, spun, and leapt, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next. The crowd gasped and applauded at particularly impressive maneuvers. "Continental style," Holmes commented quietly to Watson. "Austrian, specifically, with some Russian influences. Note the precision of his edges and the height of his jumps." Watson watched with genuine admiration, though he found his attention repeatedly drawn to Holmes rather than the performer. The detective was studying the skater with intense focus, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "You suspect him?" Watson asked under his breath. "I observe him," Holmes corrected mildly. "There is a difference. His technique is exceptional, professional level. Yet he presents himself as a dilettante, an entertainer. Interesting contradiction." As the performance reached its conclusion, the skater executed a final dramatic spin and finished with a deep, theatrical bow. Coins clinked on the ice as appreciative spectators tossed their contributions. The man gathered these with practiced efficiency before skating toward the edge of the circle, directly toward where Holmes and Watson stood. "Mr. Holmes," the skater said as he approached, his accent distinctly Central European, "I had heard rumours of your presence at the fair. An honour to perform before London's greatest detective." Holmes inclined his head slightly, betraying no surprise at being recognised. "You have me at a disadvantage, sir. You know my name, but I do not know yours." "Anton Drobnik, at your service." The man executed another smaller bow. "Formerly of the Imperial Ice Ballet of Vienna, now a humble performer on London's miraculous frozen Thames." "Your skills hardly suggest humility, Mr. Drobnik," Holmes observed. "They speak of years of rigorous training and natural talent." Drobnik smiled, revealing perfect white teeth that stood out against his tanned face. "You are too kind. But then you yourself know what it is to master a difficult discipline, do you not? We are not so different, you and I." "Perhaps," Holmes allowed, "though I suspect my performances draw somewhat smaller crowds." This elicited a genuine laugh from the skater. "Modesty does not become you, Mr. Holmes. Your reputation fills theatres of the mind across London and beyond." His expression shifted slightly, becoming more serious. "I understand you are investigating some unusual occurrences at the fair?" "News travels quickly," Watson remarked, speaking for the first time. Drobnik shrugged elegantly. "The ice carries whispers, Doctor. And when Sherlock Holmes takes an interest in something, people notice." He glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Perhaps I could be of assistance? I am on the ice from dawn until late night. I see much that others might miss." "And what have you seen that might interest us?" Holmes asked, his tone neutral, but attentive. "Shadows where there should be none. Movements too swift and precise to be casual skaters." Drobnik's eyes glittered in the lamplight. "And a woman who watches everyone with the eyes of a hawk, particularly those of us who know how to truly move on ice." "This woman," Holmes prompted. "Can you describe her?" "Tall, elegant, with the bearing of nobility. Dark hair, pale skin, high cheekbones that speak of Slavic blood. She wears silver-bladed skates of exceptional quality, Russian manufacture, if I'm not mistaken." "The same woman Tim mentioned," Watson murmured to Holmes. "And have you spoken with this mysterious observer?" Holmes asked Drobnik. The skater shook his head. She avoids direct interaction. When approached, she retreats. But her eyes miss nothing. He paused, seeming to consider whether to continue. There is one other thing, Mr. Holmes. Last night, after the fair had closed, and most had gone home, I remained to practice some figures in the moonlight. I saw a shadow moving near the vendor stalls, too quick, too purposeful to be an ordinary night watchman. Did you investigate? I attempted to, Drobnik admitted. But when I approached, there was a sudden hiss, and a cloud of white vapour or smoke. When it cleared, nothing remained, like a theatrical disappearance on the stage. Holmes nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Most interesting, Mr. Drobnik. You've been most helpful. I'm at your disposal, Mr. Holmes, the skater replied with another small bow. If you need a guide on the ice or another pair of eyes, you need only ask. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have another performance scheduled near Southwark Bridge in 15 minutes. With a flourish, Drobnik turned and glided away, moving through the crowd with effortless precision. Holmes watched him go, his expression unreadable. What do you make of him? Watson asked when the skater was out of earshot. A man of contradictions, Holmes replied. His skating speaks of discipline and training, yet there is an air of improvisation about his manner. He volunteers information almost too readily, yet I detect no obvious falsehood in his account. The night had deepened around the Frost Fair, transforming its character yet again. The families and casual visitors had largely departed, leaving behind a more determined sort of reveller. The lamps burned lower, creating pools of golden light surrounded by deepening shadows. Along the edges of the fair, some vendors were beginning to pack their wares, while others, particularly those selling hot drinks laced with spirits, seemed prepared to continue well into the small hours. Holmes and Watson had spent the last hour moving methodically through the fair, speaking with anyone who claimed to have witnessed something unusual. The accounts varied widely in detail, but shared common elements. A figure moving with unnatural speed across the ice, disappearing in mist or smoke, and always appearing around midnight. It's remarkable how a few sightings can spawn such elaborate folklore in less than 2 days, Watson observed as they paused near a quieter section of the fair. Their breath formed perfect clouds in the still, cold air. Half the people we've spoken to claim the phantom walks through solid objects or floats above the ice. The human mind abhors a mystery without embellishment, Holmes replied, his eyes continuously scanning the thinning crowd. Given an unexplained phenomenon, people inevitably add details that conform to their expectations of the supernatural, rather than considering more prosaic explanations. They had found a relatively secluded spot, near one of the bridge supports, where the ice met the stone foundations of Blackfriars. The location offered both shelter from the bitter wind that had begun to rise, and an excellent vantage point to observe a large section of the fair without being easily noticed. "And what is your prosaic explanation, Holmes?" Watson asked, stamping his feet gently to keep warm. The temperature had dropped further as midnight approached, and even their exertions on skates couldn't entirely ward off the cold. Holmes pulled out his pipe, but did not light it, merely turning it thoughtfully in his gloved hands. "I have several theories, but insufficient data to eliminate all but one. The missing items form a pattern, though its purpose remains elusive. Food, ribbons, a mirror, ordinary objects of minimal value, yet specifically selected. Perhaps meant to sustain someone living rough, Watson suggested. A vagrant who's found shelter nearby and ventures onto the ice for supplies. Possible, but it doesn't explain the theatrical elements, the smoke, the apparent vanishing. Holmes tucked his pipe away and gestured toward a small wooden structure about 50 yards away. That tent belongs to Madame Zora, a self-proclaimed fortune-teller who arrived with the fare. I suggest we consult her next. Watson raised an eyebrow. I didn't think you put much stock in fortune-tellers, Holmes. A rare smile flickered across Holmes's face. I don't. But those who make a profession of observing human nature and manipulating expectations often notice things others miss. And she has the advantage of a position near where 2 of the thefts occurred. They made their way across the ice, moving carefully through the increasingly uneven surface where the day's traffic had created ruts and ridges. The fortune-teller's tent was painted with crude stars and moons, and a small sign proclaimed, Madame Zora, Secrets of Past and Future Revealed. A bell tinkled softly as they pushed aside the heavy velvet curtain that served as a door. The interior was warmer than Watson had expected, heated by a small brazier that cast a reddish glow over the cramped space. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, something exotic, with notes of sandalwood and myrrh. Seated behind a small table, draped in dark blue cloth, was a woman of indeterminate age, her features partially obscured by a colourful scarf wrapped around her head and lower face. "Gentlemen," she greeted them, her voice carrying a hint of an accent that Watson couldn't quite place, perhaps Mediterranean or Eastern European. "You seek answers, not fortunes. Please, be seated." Holmes raised an eyebrow, but took one of the 2 stools opposite her, without comment. Watson followed suit, finding the tiny furniture barely adequate for his frame. "You have the advantage of us, Madame Zora," Holmes remarked. "How did you know we're not here to have our palms read?" The woman's dark eyes crinkled above her scarf, suggesting a smile. "A fortune-teller who cannot read intentions would indeed be a poor fortune-teller indeed, Mr. Holmes. You know me? All of London knows the great detective and his loyal doctor." She gestured toward their skates. "Though you come disguised as pleasure-seekers, your eyes search for more than entertainment. You hunt a ghost, yes?" Holmes leaned forward slightly. "We are investigating reports of unusual occurrences on the ice. I believe you may have witnessed something from your vantage point." Madame Zora remained silent for a long moment, her eyes studying Holmes intently. Finally, she nodded once, decisively. "I have seen what others call the phantom. It is not a spirit, but it is also not entirely natural." "Explain," Holmes prompted when she paused. 2 nights ago, when the Thames first froze, before the fair began proper. I was setting up my tent, working late by lamplight. Just before midnight, I heard a sound, like a blade, cutting cleanly through ice, but continuous, rhythmic. She demonstrated with a flowing motion of her hand. I looked out across the river and saw a figure moving with impossible grace, faster than any human should move, leaving a trail of mist behind it. "Could you describe this figure?" Holmes asked, his voice neutral but attentive. "Tall, slender, wearing something that flowed like dark water behind it. The face," she shook her head. "The face was white, blank, like a mask, or like nothing at all." "A covered face, perhaps," Watson suggested. "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "but the stillness of it was unnatural. And when it moved—" She shuddered slightly, a gesture that seemed genuine rather than theatrical. It moved as if the ice were not solid but liquid, as if it were part of the Thames itself. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And did this figure approach your tent or the other vendors?" "Not that first night. It remained distant, near the middle of the river, almost as if practicing." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "But last night it came closer. I watched through a gap in my tent. It moved among the stalls, stopping at Tolliver's Chestnuts, at the ribbon seller's table, at the baker's stand. Each time it would pause, extend a hand that seemed too long, too thin, and then items would simply disappear." "You saw no actual theft, no opening of containers or unwrapping of coverings?" Holmes pressed. Madame Zora shook her head. "Nothing so ordinary. It was as if the objects passed through the coverings, and then, when the phantom had taken what it wanted, it created a cloud of white mist and vanished within it." Watson shifted uncomfortably on his small stool. The fortune-teller's account matched the others they had heard, yet her delivery carried a conviction that the others had lacked. Either she was an exceptional performer, or she truly believed what she had witnessed. "Did you report what you saw to the authorities?" Holmes asked. A short laugh escaped her. "The police? They would dismiss me as a superstitious old woman, and besides—" She hesitated. "I am not entirely legal in my residence here, Mr. Holmes. My papers are complicated." Holmes nodded, understanding her reluctance. "One final question, Madame Zora. Have you noticed anyone taking particular interest in these events? Someone watching too carefully, or asking questions similar to ours?" The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "There is a woman, tall, elegant, with the bearing of aristocracy. She comes each day, watches everything, speaks to no one. Her eyes are cold, like the ice itself." "Russian?" Holmes suggested. "Polish," Madame Zora corrected firmly. "I know the difference. She moves like a dancer on the ice, but her eyes, they are hunting eyes." Holmes reached into his pocket and placed a silver coin on the table. "Thank you for your insights, Madame. You have been most helpful." The fortune-teller made no move to take the coin immediately. "A warning, Mr. Holmes. Whatever this phantom is, spirit or flesh, it is dangerous. Not in the ordinary way of knives or pistols, but in the way of those who have nothing to lose." "I shall bear that in mind," Holmes replied, rising from the too small stool. "Good evening, Madame Zora." Outside the tent, the air felt shockingly cold after the incense-warmed interior. Watson took a deep breath, clearing his lungs of the heavy scent. "What do you make of her account, Holmes?" he asked, as they moved away from the tent. "It seemed fanciful, yet she appeared genuinely disturbed by what she'd seen." "Madame Zora is more observant than most," Holmes replied. "Strip away the theatrical elements of her description, and we have useful details. A tall, slender figure, using a means of propulsion that appears unusual to the casual observer, employing some device to create mist or smoke as a distraction, and selecting very specific items to take." They had reached the center of the fair again, where the crowd, though diminished, remained substantial. A clock somewhere on shore struck the quarter hour. 15 minutes until midnight. "Do you expect our phantom to make an appearance tonight?" Watson asked, glancing around at the ice fair, which now seemed more mysterious than merry in the late-night hours. "I think it's likely," Holmes replied. "If our mysterious thief follows the pattern established, midnight should bring another visitation. The question is whether they will be deterred by the larger crowd tonight or emboldened by it. Holmes guided them toward a darkened area between two vendor stalls that had closed for the night. "Let us wait here," he suggested. "The position offers a clear view of much of the fair, while keeping us relatively inconspicuous." They stood in comfortable silence as the minutes passed. The temperature continued to drop, and Watson was grateful for the heavy woolen scarf wrapped around his neck and the warm gloves that protected his hands. The fair had grown quieter, the music fading as musicians packed their instruments against the cold. Only the more determined revelers remained, clustered around the stalls selling hot drinks, their laughter occasionally ringing out across the ice. "Holmes," Watson said suddenly, keeping his voice low, "at your 3 o'clock, is that our Polish observer?" Holmes turned slightly, his gaze following Watson's subtle nod. Standing at the edge of a pool of lamplight about 30 yards away was a tall woman in a fur-trimmed coat of deep burgundy. Her dark hair was partially covered by a matching hat, but her striking features were clearly visible. High cheekbones, a proud nose, and intense eyes that scanned the fair with methodical precision. "Indeed," Holmes murmured, "and observe how she stands, perfectly balanced on her skates, without a single adjustment or shift of weight. The mark of an expert." Even as they watched, the woman seemed to sense their attention. Her gaze snapped toward their position with unsettling accuracy, though Watson was certain they were well concealed in the shadows. For a brief moment, her eyes locked with Holmes, an almost tangible connection across the distance. Then, with a slight inclination of her head that might have been acknowledgement, she turned and glided away with remarkable grace, disappearing into the thinning crowd. "She knew exactly where we were," Watson remarked with surprise. "Yes," Holmes agreed. "Most interesting. And now, Watson, the hour approaches. Let us prepare to meet our phantom." The final minutes before midnight brought a subtle change to the atmosphere of the Frost Fair. Perhaps it was merely the effect of the dwindling crowd or the deepening cold, but Watson felt a palpable shift in the air, an expectancy, as if the ice itself were holding its breath. The remaining revelers had gathered in tight clusters around the few stalls still serving hot drinks, their laughter and conversation creating islands of human warmth in the expanding sea of silence. Holmes had guided them to a new vantage point beneath the dark shadow of Blackfriars Bridge, where one of the massive stone pillars met the frozen river. Here they could observe a significant portion of the fair while remaining virtually invisible themselves. The position offered another advantage, protection from the bitter wind that had risen as midnight approached, carrying tiny crystals of ice that stung any exposed skin. "Remarkable how cold it grows," Watson murmured, adjusting his scarf to cover more of his face. His breath emerged in perfect plumes of white vapor, hanging momentarily in the still air before dissipating. Even Afghanistan's winter nights hardly felt this penetrating. "It is the proximity to the ice," Holmes replied, his voice low. "We are essentially standing within an enormous natural cooling chamber. The Thames has become London's icebox." They had removed their skates temporarily to allow better footing on the uneven surface near the bridge pillar, and Watson found himself missing their warmth despite the awkwardness of walking in them. He stamped his feet gently, trying to maintain circulation without making noise that might reveal their position. Holmes remained perfectly still, his tall figure almost statue-like in its immobility. Only his eyes moved, scanning the fair with methodical precision. He had positioned himself so that his dark coat blended with the shadow of the bridge, rendering him nearly invisible to anyone more than a few feet away. 3 minutes to midnight, Holmes whispered, consulting his pocket watch by feel rather than sight. Observe the Polish woman. She has repositioned herself near the fortune-teller's tent. An excellent choice for surveillance. Watson followed Holmes's gaze and spotted the tall figure in the burgundy coat. She stood partially concealed behind a closed vendor's stall, her posture alert, but casual enough not to draw attention from the few passers-by. Like them, she was clearly waiting for something to happen. "Do you think she's involved with our phantom?" Watson asked. "She is certainly involved in the pursuit of whoever or whatever it might be," Holmes replied, "though whether as confederate or adversary remains to be seen." A clock on shore began to toll the midnight hour, its deep resonance carrying clearly across the frozen river. The remaining revellers paid it no mind, but Watson noticed how the woman in burgundy tensed slightly at the first stroke. Holmes, too, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, like a hunting cat preparing to spring. As the final toll faded into the night, a curious hush fell over the fair. Even the distant laughter seemed momentarily subdued, as if the very air had thickened around them. Watson found himself holding his breath, though he couldn't have explained exactly what he was expecting to see. "There," Holmes breathed, so softly that Watson barely heard him. At first, Watson saw nothing unusual, just the familiar layout of stalls and tents, illuminated by lamps that seemed to burn lower in the intense cold. Then, at the far edge of his vision, a movement caught his attention. It was difficult to discern at this distance, but something was gliding across the ice from the direction of Southwark, moving with a fluid grace that immediately struck him as different from the ordinary fairgoers. "I see it," Watson whispered, "coming from the south bank." Holmes nodded once, his eyes never leaving the approaching figure. "Observe its movement, Watson. No hesitation, no adjustment for the uneven surface. Either our phantom knows the ice intimately, or possesses extraordinary skill." As the figure drew closer, Watson could make out more details. It was indeed tall and slender, dressed entirely in black, with some sort of flowing cape or cloak that billowed behind it like dark water. But it was the face, or rather the lack of one, that sent an involuntary chill down his spine. Where features should have been visible, there was only a smooth, white oval, reflecting the lamplight with an unnatural gleam. "A mask," Holmes murmured, answering Watson's unspoken question. "And quite cleverly designed. The reflective surface makes it difficult to focus on, drawing the eye away rather than toward it." The phantom moved with increasing speed toward the center of the fair, its progress so smooth it almost appeared to be floating above the ice, rather than travelling upon it. The few late-night revellers who noticed its approach fell silent, some backing away, in alarm, others watching with the fascinated horror of those witnessing something outside their experience. "It's heading toward the closed stalls," Holmes observed, "just as our witnesses described, and note how the ice behind it bears no visible marks. Most ingenious." Indeed, Watson could see no trail of skate marks or footprints in the phantom's wake, though the ice in this area was already crisscrossed with the day's traffic, making individual tracks difficult to discern in the dim light. The phantom reached the first row of closed stalls, the same area where the previous thefts had occurred. It paused before Tolliver's chestnut stand, which was now shuttered for the night. With movements that seemed unnaturally fluid, it extended a black-gloved hand toward the locked container where the vendor stored his goods. "Remarkable," Holmes breathed. "Watch carefully, Watson." The Phantom's hand hovered over the container for several seconds, then withdrew, now holding something small that Watson couldn't identify at this distance. No lock had been broken, no covering disturbed. It was as if the object had simply passed through the solid barrier. "Now," Holmes said suddenly, pushing away from the bridge pillar, "we must move while it's occupied. Stay close and follow my lead." Before Watson could respond, Holmes had reattached his skates with remarkable speed and was gliding silently across the ice, keeping to the shadows wherever possible. Watson hastened to follow, his fingers fumbling slightly with the unfamiliar fastenings in his haste. By the time he pushed off to follow, Holmes had already covered half the distance to the Phantom, moving with the silent efficiency of a hunting predator. Watson did his best to match Holmes's quiet approach, grateful for the ambient sounds of the fair that masked what little noise their skates made on the hard surface. The Phantom remained focused on the vendor stalls, moving from Tolliver's stand to the closed tent of the ribbon seller. Again, that strange, hovering gesture, followed by the withdrawal of a small object that disappeared somewhere within the dark clothing. Holmes had paused behind a stack of empty crates, motioning for Watson to join him. From this new vantage point, they had a clearer view of the Phantom's activities without being exposed. The mysterious figure completed its inspection of the ribbon seller's tent and turned toward the baker's stall, still apparently unaware of their presence. "It will use the smoke device after visiting the third stall," Holmes whispered. "That's when we must act. I'll approach you from the right, you from the left. Do not attempt to grab it. Merely prevent its escape toward the south bank." Watson nodded his understanding, loosening his scarf slightly to ensure it wouldn't impede his movements. The cold air bit at his exposed neck, but he ignored the discomfort, focusing instead on the Phantom now bending over the baker's locked storage chest. As they watched, the Phantom completed its mysterious theft and straightened. For a moment, it remained perfectly still, as if listening, or perhaps surveying, its surroundings. Then it reached into its flowing cloak and withdrew something that gleamed dully in the lamplight. A metallic object, about the size of a large egg. "Now, Watson," Holmes hissed, pushing off with powerful strokes that sent him gliding swiftly toward the Phantom from the right. Watson launched himself from the left, his military training overcoming his limited experience on skates. He moved with determination, if not Holmes' fluid grace, cutting off the Phantom's easiest escape route back toward Southwark. The Phantom became aware of their approach almost immediately. It turned with startling quickness, the blank white mask revealing nothing of the face behind it. For a heartbeat, it seemed to assess the situation. Holmes approaching rapidly from one side, Watson from the other, with the largely empty fair behind it, and the bridge ahead. Then, with a theatrical gesture, the Phantom raised the metallic object and dashed it against the ice at its feet. A loud hiss filled the air, followed immediately by a billowing cloud of white vapor that expanded with remarkable speed, engulfing the Phantom completely. Holmes reached the edge of the rapidly expanding cloud first, hesitating only briefly before plunging into the obscuring mist. Watson followed seconds later, bracing himself for a possible confrontation within the artificial fog. The vapour was surprisingly dense, limiting visibility to mere inches and carrying a chemical odour that reminded Watson of certain compounds from his medical studies. "Holmes," he called, unable to see anything in the whiteout conditions. "Here, Watson," came the reply from somewhere to his right. "Careful. The ice is slick with condensation." Watson moved cautiously toward the sound of Holmes's voice, one hand extended to prevent collision. The fog was already beginning to dissipate, carried away by the night breeze, revealing patches of the fair around them. Of the phantom, however, there was no sign. "It's gone," Watson exclaimed, as the last of the mist cleared, revealing the empty space where the figure had stood moments before. "Not gone," Holmes corrected, kneeling to examine something on the ice. "Merely removed to another location, and in considerable haste, judging by this." He held up a small object that gleamed silver in the lamplight, a button or clasp of some kind, decorated with an intricate pattern that Watson couldn't quite make out. "Left behind in their escape," Holmes explained, pocketing the item. "But, more importantly, observe the ice here, Watson." Watson looked down and noticed what had captured Holmes's attention. In the area where the phantom had stood, barely visible, unless one knew to look for them, were two parallel lines carved into the ice surface, thin, precise cuts, unlike the broader marks left by conventional skates. "Blade marks?" Watson asked, kneeling beside Holmes for a closer look. "Indeed, but not from any ordinary skate." Holmes ran a gloved finger along one of the marks. Exceptionally narrow, designed to minimize friction and visible tracking. Combined with the chemical fog device, it creates the perfect illusion of a vanishing phantom. A soft sound behind them caused both men to turn quickly. The Polish woman in the burgundy coat stood watching them, her own skates having made virtually no noise on the ice. Up close, Watson could see that she was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps 35, with striking features that combined strength and elegance. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her accent confirming Madame Zora's identification of her nationality. "I see we share an interest in this phantom." Holmes rose smoothly to his feet, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "You have the advantage of us, madam." "Countess Irina Zaleska," she replied with a slight inclination of her head that managed to be both polite and imperious. "And you need not introduce yourself or Dr. Watson. Your reputations precede you." "As does yours, Countess," Holmes responded. "The Polish national ice skating champion for 3 consecutive years, if I'm not mistaken. Your performances at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg are still discussed in certain circles." A flicker of surprise crossed the woman's face before her composed expression returned. "You are well informed, Mr. Holmes. That was another lifetime ago. Before your husband's unfortunate involvement in the failed uprising," Holmes added, his tone neutral but watchful, "which led to the confiscation of your estates and your subsequent career change." The Countess's eyes narrowed slightly, but she showed no other reaction to Holmes's provocative statement. "My past is irrelevant to the matter at hand, Mr. Holmes. What concerns me is the individual who makes a mockery of true skating skill with these childish theatrics and petty thefts." "You've been observing the phantom's activities," Holmes said. It was not a question. "For 3 nights now," she confirmed. "At first, I thought it merely a clever entertainer, someone capitalizing on the fair to create a local legend. But there is something purposeful about the thefts that suggests a more specific intent. And what brings a Polish countess to take such interest in minor thefts on the Thames? Watson asked, unable to contain his curiosity. The countess turned her cool gaze to him. Professional interest, Doctor. The techniques being employed, the specialized skates, the chemical diversions, they are not common knowledge. They suggest someone with particular training. Training that you yourself possess? Holmes suggested quietly. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. I was many things before I was merely a countess, Mr. Holmes, as were most of my countrymen who survived the Tsar's attentions. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of a police constable, his face red with cold and exertion as he laboured across the ice in his standard-issue boots. Mr. Holmes, he called, recognizing the detective. Was that some sort of explosion just now? We saw the cloud from the shore patrol. Nothing so dramatic, Constable, Holmes replied smoothly. A simple chemical reaction, part of an experiment I was conducting related to ice composition. My apologies if it caused any alarm. The constable looked relieved. Right you are, sir. Should have known it was something scientific with you involved. He touched his hat respectfully. Evening to you all, then. As the constable made his awkward way back toward shore, the Countess raised an eyebrow at Holmes. You protect the Phantom's secret, Mr. Holmes. I protect the integrity of my investigation, Countess, Holmes corrected. Premature involvement of the police would only drive our quarry deeper into hiding. Now, you are about to explain your particular interest in this case. The Countess considered him for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. I believe the Phantom may be someone I once knew, someone who disappeared under complicated circumstances. If I am correct, their presence in London could have implications beyond these trivial thefts. A name would be helpful, Holmes prompted when she did not continue. When I have confirmation, Mr. Holmes, not before. She adjusted her fur-lined gloves with deliberate movements. For now, let us say that we share a common goal in apprehending this individual, though perhaps for different reasons. And do you propose we work together toward this common goal? Holmes asked, his tone suggesting neither acceptance nor rejection of the idea. I propose an exchange of information, she replied. You have resources in London that I lack. I have knowledge of certain specialized techniques that might prove useful. Holmes studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded once. A conditional arrangement, then. We will meet tomorrow at noon near the skate rental. You will bring a detailed description of who you suspect our Phantom to be and why. In exchange, I will share what I deduce from this. He held up the small silver object he had recovered from the ice. The Countess's eyes fixed on it immediately, a flash of recognition quickly suppressed. Until tomorrow, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. She inclined her head slightly before turning and gliding away with the same effortless grace they had observed earlier, her burgundy coat soon disappearing among the now nearly deserted fair structures. You trust her, Holmes? Watson asked once she was out of earshot. Not in the slightest, Holmes replied, pocketing the silver object again. But she knows far more about our Phantom than she revealed, and I intend to discover exactly what that knowledge entails. He turned, scanning the area where the Phantom had performed its vanishing act. For now, Watson, let us examine the scene more thoroughly before the night erases what evidence remains. Our phantom may leave no footprints, but it has left us something far more valuable, a pattern of behavior that speaks as clearly as any physical trace. With that, Holmes knelt once more to study the faint marks on the ice, his keen eyes missing nothing in the dim light of the fair's remaining lamps. The midnight encounter had provided new pieces to the puzzle, and Watson knew that Holmes would not rest until each one had found its proper place. Morning arrived with reluctance, as if the sun itself struggled against the bitter cold that held London in its grip. Holmes and Watson had returned to Baker Street in the early hours, after thoroughly examining the scene of the phantom's appearance. They had risen early, despite their late night, and now found themselves in a hansom cab, heading once more toward the Thames, though not directly to the Frost Fair. Wapping Old Stairs, Holmes had instructed the driver, settling back against the worn leather seat with the air of a man embarking on a promising expedition. And there's an extra shilling if you avoid the main thoroughfares. The morning traffic will be intolerable. Watson huddled deeper into his coat, still feeling the chill of the previous night in his bones, despite the warmth of Mrs. Hudson's excellent breakfast. "Are you certain we shouldn't be meeting the Countess at the fair?" he asked. "Noon will be upon us before we realize it." "We have ample time," Holmes replied, watching London pass by through the frosted window. "And what we may learn at Wapping could prove essential to understanding our phantom's methods. Besides, I sent a note round to the Countess at her hotel, suggesting we meet at 2 rather than noon." "You know where she's staying?" Watson asked, somewhat surprised. Holmes smiled faintly. "Langham, of course. Where else would a Polish countess of reduced circumstances, but still substantial means, reside while in London? Their guest register confirmed it when I made inquiries this morning while you were finishing breakfast." The cab turned down a narrow side street, the buildings pressing close on either side as they descended toward the river. Here, the architectural grandeur of central London gave way to the more practical, weathered structures of the working Thames, warehouses with massive doors designed for cargo, chandlery stocked with maritime supplies, and public houses that had served river workers for generations. "You still haven't explained our destination," Watson prompted, as the cab navigated the increasingly narrow streets. "What exactly are we seeking at Wapping Old Stairs?" "Knowledge, Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes brightening with anticipation. "Knowledge of the Thames that only those who have worked its waters for decades possess. If our phantom is utilizing the frozen river with such confidence, then understanding the Thames itself becomes essential." The cab came to a halt at the end of a narrow street that opened onto a small, stone-paved area overlooking the river. A set of ancient stone steps, Wapping Old Stairs, descended from this vantage point down to the Thames, though they now led to ice rather than water. A handful of men were gathered near the top of the stairs, stamping their feet against the cold, breath-forming clouds in the morning air, as they conversed in the shorthand language of long-time colleagues. Holmes paid the driver and added the promised extra shilling before stepping out into the biting cold. Watson followed, taking in the scene with interest. The men gathered at the stairs represented a particular London type: river workers, their faces weathered by years of exposure to the elements, their clothing practical rather than fashionable, their hands bearing the calluses of physical labour. Wapping Old Stairs has been a gathering point for Thames watermen since Tudor times, Holmes explained as they approached. When the river freezes, putting them temporarily out of work, they still gather here out of habit and tradition. Some of them come from families that have worked the Thames for 10 generations or more. One of the men, older than the others, with a face so lined it resembled a well-used map, noticed their approach and straightened slightly. "Well now, what brings the likes of you gentlemen down to Wapping this bitter morning?" he called out, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of a lifelong East Londoner. "The Thames itself brings us, and the wisdom of those who know it best," Holmes replied, stopping a respectful distance from the group. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We seek information that only watermen might possess." The old man's eyes sharpened with recognition. "Sherlock Holmes, is it? The detective fellow from the papers?" He looked Holmes up and down with the appraising eye of someone accustomed to judging character quickly. "I'm Jacob Tideway, 43 years on these waters. What sort of information would you be needing that brings you to us, rather than your fancy government contacts?" Holmes smiled, clearly appreciating the man's directness. "Information about the Thames when frozen, Mr. Tideway. About its secrets and its dangers, its passages and its history, particularly as it relates to the area around Blackfriars and Southwark, where the current frost fair stands." Tideway exchanged glances with his companions, a silent communication passing between them. "This about that ghost they're all talking about at the fair? The one that slides around at midnight stealing bits and bobs?" "You've heard of it?" Watson asked, somewhat surprised that news had spread so quickly. Tideway snorted, creating a substantial cloud of vapour in the cold air. "Course we have. Thamesmen hear everything that happens on our river, frozen or flowing. Been some strange business these past nights, by all accounts." "And what do Thamesmen make of these strange occurrences?" Holmes inquired, his tone respectful rather than condescending. This approach seemed to meet with approval. Tideway gestured toward the steps. "Come down a ways, gentlemen. What we need to show you is better seen than described." Holmes and Watson followed Tideway and 2 of the other watermen down the ancient stone steps. The worn treads were treacherous with ice, requiring careful footing. At the bottom, where the stairs would normally meet the water, they instead encountered the frozen surface of the Thames stretching out before them like a great white plain. "The river's different when it freezes," Tideway explained, stepping cautiously onto the ice. "Most folks just see the surface. Think of it as a solid thing all the way across. But those who know the Thames understand it ain't that simple." He led them a short distance from the stairs, then stopped and pointed downriver toward where the distant spires of the city were just visible through the morning haze. "The Thames has currents, see, even when frozen over. Some parts freeze harder and thicker than others. Where the water runs fastest, like in the centre channel, the ice forms differently." One of the younger watermen, a stocky man with powerful shoulders, tapped his foot on the ice. "What Jacob's saying is that there's paths on the frozen Thames, if you know how to find them. Places where the ice is smoothest, strongest, and there's places you'd best avoid, where it's thin or uneven beneath the snow." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, a knowledge that would give someone a significant advantage when moving across the ice, particularly at night. "Exactly so, sir," Tideway agreed. "A man who knows these paths could move twice as fast as one who doesn't, with half the effort. And there's more." He glanced at his companions again, before continuing. There's ways under and along the Thames that few know about. Passages and tunnels, some of them centuries old. This clearly captured Holmes's interest. Tunnels that might allow someone to appear and disappear at different points along the river? Some might, the old waterman acknowledged. There's an old smuggler's tunnel that runs from near Southwark Cathedral down to the river, used to come out below the waterline, but with the new embankments and the river frozen, it might open onto the ice now. The other waterman, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. And there's maintenance passages built into both Blackfriars and Southwark bridges, officially for inspection and repairs, but a man who knew the right people could gain access. Holmes absorbed this information with evident satisfaction. This is precisely the knowledge we needed, gentlemen. Now, tell me, have any of you observed unusual activities on the ice these past nights, particularly around midnight, near the Frost Fair? Tideway exchanged glances with his companions before answering. Can't say as. We've seen anything ourselves. We're rivermen, not night watchmen. But... He hesitated, then continued in a lower voice. Young Billy here heard something you might find interesting. The stocky younger man nodded. 2 nights ago, I was checking my father's boat, making sure the ice hadn't damaged the hull. This was late, well after the fair had shut down for the night. Heard a sound out on the ice, not like a person walking or skating, but a sort of swooshing, like something being drawn across the surface, smooth and continuous. Did you see who or what made this sound? Holmes asked. Billy shook his head. Too dark, and I was under the pier. But about a minute later, I heard something else, a kind of hiss, then nothing. When I came out to look, there wasn't a soul in sight, though I could have sworn someone had just been there. Holmes nodded slowly. Most interesting, and consistent with our own observations. He turned back to Tideway. You mentioned the ice forms differently in the centre channel. Would these paths you described extend all the way across the Thames? For someone who knows what they're about, certainly, Tideway confirmed. The right equipment helps too. Regular skates are fine for pleasure, but not for serious ice travel. What would you recommend for serious ice travel, Mr. Tideway? Holmes inquired. The old waterman smiled slightly. For that, you'd want to talk to old Morris at the Custom House. He's been making ice gear for Thamesmen since before I was born. If there's a better way to move on frozen water, he'd know of it. Holmes reached into his coat and produced several coins, offering them to Tideway. You've been extraordinarily helpful. Perhaps you could direct us to old Morris? Tideway accepted the coins with a nod of thanks. 2 streets east, look for a narrow alley between the chandlery and the tobacco warehouse. Morris's workshop is at the end, though you might not recognize it as such. No sign, just a blue door with a skate blade painted on it. After thanking the waterman, Holmes and Watson made their way along the icy waterfront toward the location Tideway had described. The morning was advancing, the weak winter sun doing little to dispel the bitter cold. Few people were about, most sensible Londoners remaining indoors when possible or hurrying to their destinations, with collars turned up against the wind. These passages and tunnels could explain how our phantom appears and disappears so effectively, Watson observed as they walked, though it doesn't account for the mask or the theatrical elements. Those are part of a deliberate performance, Holmes replied, designed to create confusion and misdirection. What interests me is the purpose behind it all. The items taken are of minimal value, yet selected with apparent care. There is an underlying pattern that still eludes me. They found the alley Tideway had described without difficulty, a narrow passage between two imposing warehouses that would be easy to miss if one weren't specifically looking for it. At its end stood a weathered door, painted a faded blue, with the simple outline of a skate blade visible despite years of repainting. Holmes rapped firmly on the door. After a considerable pause, during which they could hear movement inside, it opened to reveal a small, wiry man with spectacles perched on a prominent nose. His clothes were well worn but clean, and his hands bore the distinctive calluses and small scars of a craftsman. "Don't recall asking for visitors," he said by way of greeting, eyeing them suspiciously. "Mr. Morris, I presume?" Holmes inquired politely. "Jacob Tideway suggested we consult you regarding specialized equipment for ice navigation. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson." The name produced a flicker of recognition in the old man's eyes. "The detective, is it? Investigating something to do with the ice, then?" He considered them for a moment longer, then stepped back. "Well, come in before you let all the heat out. Though I don't see how my humble work could interest a gentleman detective." The workshop was blessedly warm after the chill outside, heated by a small but efficient stove in one corner. The space was smaller than Watson had expected, but impeccably organized. Tools hung in careful arrangements on the walls, and work tables held various projects in different stages of completion. Most prominently, several pairs of what appeared to be ice skates were displayed on a central table, though they looked unlike any Watson had seen before. Holmes immediately gravitated toward these, examining them with evident interest. "These are not ordinary recreational skates," he observed. "Nothing ordinary leaves my workshop, Mr. Holmes," Morris replied, a hint of pride breaking through his gruff exterior. "Those are what we call Thames runners, designed specifically for the rare occasions when our river freezes. The blade configuration allows for greater speed and control than common skates, particularly on rough, natural ice." Holmes picked up one of the skates, turning it over in his hands, with the careful attention he gave to all potential evidence. "The blade is remarkable, much thinner than standard, with a different profile entirely." Morris nodded, warming to his subject. "That's Dutch influence, that is. The Netherlands freezes regularly, so they've perfected ice travel in ways we English haven't had cause to. The blade is hardened steel, but flexible in just the right ways, leaves barely a mark on the ice when used properly." "Barely a mark," Holmes repeated, looking up sharply. Could these skates, in the hands of a skilled user, leave tracks that might be almost invisible to the casual observer? "In the right conditions, certainly," Morris confirmed. "On hard, clear ice, with the proper technique, they'd leave little more than a fine line. Nothing like the gouges those clumsy rental skates make." Watson moved closer to examine the skates Holmes was holding. "These could explain the Phantom's apparently trackless movement," he suggested quietly. Holmes nodded, then addressed Morris again. "Have you made many pairs of these specialized skates? I'm particularly interested in any you might have sold or repaired recently." The craftsman's expression grew guarded. "My clients expect discretion, Mr. Holmes. I don't discuss who orders what." "Of course," Holmes agreed smoothly. "I wouldn't ask you to violate such confidences. Perhaps instead you could tell me if anyone has commissioned any unusual modifications to such skates lately, strictly in the abstract, as a matter of technical interest. Morris studied Holmes for a long moment, clearly weighing his professional discretion against his curiosity about the detective's interest. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. There was something, he admitted. About a month ago. Not a new commission, but modifications to an existing pair. High-quality skates, continental make, probably Austrian or German. The client wanted changes to the blade mountings, adjustments to alter the weight distribution and the blade angle. What would such modifications achieve? Holmes asked. In the right hands, extraordinary maneuverability, Morris explained. The ability to turn and stop almost instantly, to change direction without losing momentum. Techniques used in performance skating, but these modifications went beyond what you'd need for simple exhibitions. And the client, Holmes prompted gently. Without violating confidences, could you describe them in general terms? Morris frowned slightly, considering how to answer. Not English, he said finally. European accent, though I couldn't place it exactly. Well-dressed, obviously educated, knew precisely what they wanted, spoke about ice techniques like someone with extensive experience. Man or woman? Watson asked. A man, Morris replied. Tall, lean build, dark hair, clean-shaven, carried himself like a performer, or perhaps a sportsman, that particular kind of physical confidence. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. One final question, Mr. Morris. These modifications you described, would they leave any distinctive mark or pattern on the ice? Something that might identify these particular skates? The craftsman considered this. Possibly. The angle of the blade edge was unusual, might leave a slightly asymmetrical cut pattern, and there was a small notch at the heel of each blade. A request I found odd at the time said it was for a specific turning technique. A notch that might leave a distinctive mark in the right conditions, Holmes mused. Most illuminating, Mr. Morris. You've been extremely helpful. The old craftsman shrugged, though he seemed pleased by the praise. Always happy to discuss proper craftsmanship with those who appreciate it, though I still don't see what this has to do with detective work. Holmes smiled slightly as he returned the skate to the display table. Craftsmanship, Mr. Morris, often provides the key to understanding human behavior. In this case, your expertise may help us solve a rather unusual series of events on the frozen Thames. As they prepared to leave, Holmes paused at the door. One more thing. Do you create or modify any other equipment for ice travel? Devices for improved traction, or perhaps specialized tools? Morris hesitated briefly. I've been known to adapt various implements for ice conditions. Thamesmen sometimes need tools that work as well on a frozen river as a flowing one. He moved to a cabinet in the corner and withdrew a curious metal object about the size of a large pocket watch. Like this ice probe tests thickness and quality from above, or these modified boat hooks, useful for breaking through thin areas safely. Holmes examined each item with interest, but seemed to be looking for something specific. What about devices that might be used for theatrical purposes, effects that might distract or disorient observers on the ice? The craftsman's eyebrows rose slightly. Can't say I've made anything like that, though... He frowned, seemingly recalling something. The gentleman with the modified skates did ask about obtaining calcium carbide, said something about needing portable light on the ice. But when I suggested conventional lanterns, he wasn't interested. Calcium carbide, Holmes repeated with evident satisfaction. Used in certain theatrical smoke effects, I believe, when combined with water. And in miners' lamps, Watson added. Produces acetylene gas when wet, burns with a bright flame, or creates a dense vapour before ignition. Exactly so, Watson. Holmes turned back to Morris. Did you provide this calcium carbide? No, sir, the craftsman replied firmly. That's not my line. Suggested he try the theatrical supply shops around Drury Lane if it was effects he was after. Holmes nodded, apparently having confirmed something to his satisfaction. You've been extraordinarily helpful, Mr. Morris. If we may impose upon you one last time, might we examine the riverfront from your workshop? I understand you have a small dock or landing stage. Looking somewhat puzzled by this request, Morris nevertheless led them through a back door of his workshop to a narrow wooden platform, extending a short distance over what would normally be water, but was now ice. The platform offered a clear view downriver toward the bridges, and, in the distance, the colourful structures of the Frost Fair. Perfect, Holmes murmured, scanning the frozen expanse with keen eyes. From here, one can see the primary approaches to the fair, yet remain relatively inconspicuous. After thanking Morris for his time and expertise, they took their leave, emerging once more into the bitter cold of the London morning. The sun had risen higher, but provided little warmth, its light reflecting blindingly off the frozen Thames. Our next destination? Watson asked, as they turned back toward the more travelled streets, where they might find a cab. Directly to the fair, Holmes replied, checking his pocket watch. We have information to verify against the evidence we gathered last night, and soon we'll have our meeting with the Countess. The pieces are coming together, Watson, forming a pattern as distinct as skate marks on fresh ice. The Frost Fair had transformed yet again since their midnight encounter with the Phantom. Under the clear winter sky, it had grown substantially, attracting even larger crowds than the previous day. Word had spread throughout London about this rare spectacle on the Thames, drawing visitors from all walks of life. Makeshift streets had formed on the ice, with stalls and attractions arranged in increasingly organized patterns. The atmosphere was festive, almost euphoric, as if the city had collectively decided to embrace this temporary winter kingdom before it inevitably melted away. Holmes and Watson made their way carefully through the crowds, their progress slowed by the press of people eager to experience the fair. Children darted between adults' legs, their laughter rising above the general din. Street performers had claimed various spots, entertaining clusters of onlookers with juggling, music, and acrobatics. The scents of roasting chestnuts, mulled wine, and various foods filled the air, creating an invisible tapestry of aromas that complemented the visual spectacle. Remarkable how quickly it's grown, Watson observed, as they navigated around a particularly dense gathering watching a puppet show. It's as if an entire village has sprung up overnight. Human nature, Holmes replied, his eyes continuously scanning the surroundings, despite their casual pace. Given the opportunity to create something extraordinary, even temporary, people will invest remarkable energy and creativity. The Thames has become a blank canvas for London's collective imagination. They had arranged to meet the Countess near the central area of the fair, where a large circular clearing had been established for skating exhibitions. As they approached this space, they could see that a performance was already underway. A pair of skaters executing elaborate figures to the applause of the gathered spectators. "Our friend Anton Drobnik," Holmes noted, nodding toward the male performer, who was indeed the same skilled skater they had observed the previous day. "And observe his partner. She moves with remarkable precision." The female skater was petite but powerful, her movements perfectly synchronized with Drobnik's more flamboyant style. Together, they created patterns on the ice that drew appreciative gasps from the audience. "Not our Polish countess," Watson remarked, scanning the crowd for the distinctive burgundy coat they had come to associate with her. "No," Holmes agreed, "though I suspect she's observing from somewhere nearby. The Countess strikes me as someone who would take a professional interest in such a display of skill." As the performance concluded with a dramatic spin that brought the skaters face to face in a tableau of perfect balance, the crowd erupted in applause. Coins rained onto the ice, which Drobnik's partner gathered with practiced efficiency, while he acknowledged the appreciation with theatrical bows. Holmes nudged Watson and gestured subtly toward the edge of the spectator circle. There, partially obscured by a cluster of well-dressed gentlemen, stood Countess Zaleska. She was watching the performers with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest, her expression a complex mixture of appreciation and something harder to define, perhaps suspicion. "Shall we approach her?" Watson asked quietly. Holmes shook his head slightly. "Let us observe a moment longer. Sometimes what people do when they believe themselves unwatched is more revealing than any interview." As the crowd began to disperse, the Countess remained in place, her attention now fixed specifically on Drobnik, who was engaged in conversation with several admirers. The female skater had disappeared, presumably to prepare for their next performance. After a few minutes, Drobnik extricated himself from his well-wishers and moved toward a small tent set up at the edge of the performance area. Just before he entered, he paused and looked directly toward where the Countess stood, a brief but unmistakable moment of recognition passing between them. "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "They know each other, yet maintain the pretense of being strangers." The Countess turned away from the performance area and began moving with purpose through the crowd. Holmes and Watson followed at a discreet distance, watching as she navigated the fair with the same elegant efficiency she displayed on skates. "She's heading toward our designated meeting place," Watson observed after a few minutes. "Though we're early." "The Countess strikes me as someone who values punctuality," Holmes replied, "and who prefers to survey a location before committing to a conversation. Both admirable traits in their way." They allowed the Countess to reach the meeting point first, a relatively quiet area near one of the tea vendors, where several small tables had been set up on the ice. She selected one that offered a clear view of the surrounding fair while placing her back against a solid vendor's stall, then ordered tea from the aproned woman attending the tables. "A tactical choice of seating," Holmes noted with approval. "Let us join her now that she's established her preferred position." As they approached, the Countess looked up with an expression that suggested their arrival was precisely when she had expected them, neither early nor late. She inclined her head slightly in greeting. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, as they seated themselves at her table. "I trust your morning investigations were productive." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You've been having us followed, Countess." A small smile touched her lips. "Nothing so elaborate. Wapping is a logical destination for anyone investigating unusual activities on the Thames, and old Morris is the obvious expert to consult regarding specialised ice equipment. "You're familiar with him, then?" Holmes remarked, accepting the cup of tea the vendor placed before him. "I am familiar with all the finest craftsmen in their respective fields, Mr. Holmes," she replied. "My former career requires such knowledge." Watson noted how carefully she avoided specific references to her past, despite her apparent willingness to acknowledge its existence in general terms. There was something carefully constructed about the Countess, a deliberate presentation that revealed precisely what she wished, and nothing more. "And what did Morris tell you when you visited him last month?" Holmes asked casually, stirring sugar into his tea. The Countess's composure slipped for just a moment, a barely perceptible widening of the eyes before her mask of calm returned. "You continue to demonstrate your reputation is well earned, Mr. Holmes." "A simple deduction," Holmes replied. "You know Morris and his work. You possess exceptional skating skills that would benefit from specialized equipment. And you have a particular interest in our Phantom, who clearly utilizes such equipment. The connection is obvious." "Perhaps," she conceded, sipping her tea. "Though your conclusion is incorrect. I did not visit Morris last month. My most recent consultation with him was over a year ago, regarding modifications to my personal skates." Holmes studied her for a moment. "Interesting. Then you are not the only elite skater in London with knowledge of Morris's unique skills." "Indeed not," she confirmed. "Which brings us to the matter at hand. I believe I know the identity of your Phantom, Mr. Holmes, though I cannot yet prove it conclusively." She reached into her coat and withdrew a small leather case. From this she produced a photograph which she placed carefully on the table, positioning it so that only Holmes and Watson could see it. The photograph showed a man in his 30s, dressed in the formal attire of a professional performer. He stood on skates at the centre of what appeared to be a large indoor ice arena, his posture suggesting both strength and exceptional balance. His features were striking: high cheekbones, deep-set eyes, and a mouth set in an expression of intense concentration. "Nikolai Bezukov," the Countess said quietly, "former principal performer with the Imperial Russian Ice Ballet, later instructor to the Tsar's children, and eventually something else entirely." Holmes studied the photograph carefully. "This was taken some years ago," he observed. "The photographic process and the style of costume suggest at least a decade." 12 years, she confirmed, shortly before Bezukov disappeared from public performance. "And what became of him after his disappearance?" Holmes prompted. The Countess glanced around, though no one was paying them any particular attention amid the general bustle of the fair. Nevertheless, she lowered her voice further. "He became involved with certain political elements, groups opposed to the Tsar's regime. His position gave him access to information and locations normally closed to revolutionaries. A spy using his skating career as cover," Watson summarized. "Initially, perhaps," she acknowledged, "but Bezukov was always more complicated than his handlers understood. He developed his own methods, his own objectives. He became known in certain circles as the Ghost, appearing and disappearing across frozen waterways throughout Russia and Eastern Europe, leaving no trace except for missing documents or occasionally missing persons." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "And you believe this man, this Ghost, is now operating in London, stealing trinkets and food from Frost Fair vendors while creating the persona of a phantom?" Something flashed in the Countess's eyes. Irritation, perhaps, at Holmes's sceptical tone. The small thefts are misdirection, Mr. Holmes, or, perhaps, practice. Bezukov is methodical. He tests his techniques thoroughly before attempting his actual objective. Which is? Holmes pressed. That, she admitted, I do not know with certainty. But his presence in London, coinciding with the rare freezing of the Thames and the resulting fair, cannot be coincidence. Bezukov always operated during winter festivals or celebrations, using the crowds and the seasonal atmosphere as cover. Holmes sat back, his expression thoughtful as he sipped his tea. You speak with the conviction of someone with personal knowledge of these methods, Countess. More than one might gather from merely tracking a political operative. The Countess's face became perfectly still for a moment. Then, with what seemed to be a calculated decision, she nodded once. Bezukov was my skating partner for 3 years, and later, briefly, my husband. This revelation clearly caught Holmes's attention, a fact you neglected to mention in our previous conversation. It wasn't relevant until I was certain of his identity, she replied smoothly. I needed to confirm certain patterns in the Phantom's movements, techniques specific to Nikolai's particular style. Last night's observation provided that confirmation. And your interest in apprehending him? Holmes asked. Is it personal or professional? Both, she admitted. Our parting was complicated, and his activities since then have placed him on the watch lists of several European security services, including those with whom I occasionally consult. Watson glanced between the Countess and Holmes, sensing undercurrents in the conversation that went beyond the words being exchanged. There was a careful dance happening, information offered and withheld, partial truths presented in ways that might lead to different conclusions. I think, Holmes said after a thoughtful pause, that it's time we consulted a particular expert on the Phantom's stolen items. The pattern of thefts has been troubling me, and I believe I now see the purpose. He rose from the table, prompting Watson and the Countess to do likewise. But first, Countess Zaleska, I'd like your professional assessment of another skater, the performer Anton Drobnik. You seemed to take a particular interest in his exhibition earlier. Something complicated flickered across the Countess's face. Surprise at being observed, perhaps, or calculation about how to respond. Drobnik is accomplished, she said carefully. His technique shows Viennese training, but with elements I recognize from the Russian imperial style. He performs as an entertainer now, but his skills suggest more formal competition in his past. And do you know him personally? Holmes pressed. We have never been introduced, she replied, her tone perfectly neutral. Holmes nodded, though Watson could tell from the slight narrowing of his eyes that he was filing this response away for future consideration. Then let us proceed to our next destination. I believe it will prove illuminating for all of us. They made their way through the increasingly crowded fair, Holmes leading them toward the southern edge, where the ice met the embankment near Southwark. This area was less developed than the central fair, with fewer stalls and attractions, but Holmes moved with the purposeful stride of someone with a specific destination in mind. Where exactly are we going, Holmes? Watson asked as they left the main thoroughfares of the fair behind. To visit another specialist, Holmes replied, one whose expertise lies in an entirely different area than Morris's, yet one equally relevant to our investigation. They approached a small, weathered structure that appeared to have been assembled hastily at the edge of the ice. Unlike the colourful stalls of the fair proper, this was a practical construction of wood and canvas with a small sign that read simply, "Artificer." Holmes knocked on the rough wooden door, which opened to reveal a slender man of middle years, with nimble hands and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His clothes were practical but well kept, and various tools hung from a leather apron tied around his waist. "Mr. Grantham," Holmes greeted him, "I trust you received my note this morning." "Indeed, Mr. Holmes," the man replied, stepping back to allow them entry. "And I've assembled the items you inquired about. Curious collection they make, too." The interior of the small workshop was cluttered but organized, with various projects in different stages of completion arranged on tables and shelves. It smelled of metal, oil, and the distinctive odor of chemical compounds. Along one wall hung an array of theatrical masks, ranging from the beautifully detailed to the eerily abstract. "Edmund Grantham," Holmes explained to Watson and the Countess, "is one of London's premier theatrical artificers, a creator of mechanical effects and specialized props for the stage. He also consults occasionally with the Metropolitan Police on certain technical matters." Grantham nodded modestly. "Mr. Holmes has been kind enough to recommend my services to the authorities when they encounter devices outside their usual experience. And I've asked Mr. Grantham to analyze the pattern of items stolen by our phantom," Holmes continued, "particularly in light of their potential theatrical applications." Grantham moved to a small table where several objects were arranged in neat order: a bag of chestnuts, a measure of sugar, several ribbons of different colours, a small hand mirror, and what appeared to be the remnants of mince pies. "Curious selection at first glance," Grantham commented, picking up one of the ribbons, a length of vibrant red silk. "But when Mr. Holmes described the circumstances, I began to see a purpose." "Which is?" the Countess prompted when he paused. "Theatrical chemistry," Grantham replied, eyes brightening with professional enthusiasm. "Each of these items has properties useful in creating specific effects. The chestnuts and sugar, when properly prepared, produce a particular type of smoke, heavier than air, with a distinctive billowing quality useful for certain disappearing effects." He set down the ribbon and picked up the mirror. "This type of mirror, with its particular reflective quality, can be used in creating illusions of light, or misdirecting an audience's attention. And these ribbons, the specific silk used, the dye compounds, have applications in creating certain coloured flames or smokes when treated with the right chemicals." "The materials for a theatrical performance," Watson summarized. "For a very specific type of theatrical effect," Grantham corrected. "These are components used in what we call phantom illusions, techniques for making performers appear to vanish or transform while in plain sight." Holmes nodded with evident satisfaction. "Exactly as I suspected. Our phantom is acquiring materials for a larger performance, testing techniques on a small scale before attempting something more ambitious." The Countess had been examining the items with increasing intensity. "This confirms it," she said quietly. "These are precisely the materials Nikolai favoured for his effects. He was known for incorporating such illusions into his skating performances, disappearing in clouds of smoke, only to reappear elsewhere on the ice moments later." Grantham looked at her with professional interest. "You're familiar with these techniques, madam?" "I am familiar with their application," she replied carefully. though not their precise chemical composition. What else would be needed, Holmes asked Grantham, for a larger-scale version of these effects? The artificer considered the question, absently, adjusting his spectacles. Calcium carbide, certainly. It provides the basis for the most dramatic smoke effects when combined with water. Various metal salts for coloured flames, perhaps potassium chlorate or similar compounds for flash effects, and, of course, a properly designed delivery mechanism. Such as this. Holmes reached into his pocket and produced the small silver object they had recovered from the ice after the phantom's disappearance the previous night. Grantham's eyes widened with professional appreciation as he accepted the item, turning it over carefully in his practiced hands. "Exquisite craftsmanship," he murmured. "A custom-designed smoke capsule, if I'm not mistaken. The mechanism is triggered by impact, creating an immediate cloud of concealing vapour." He pointed to a small decorative element on one side of the capsule, what appeared to be an engraved insignia or maker's mark. "This is interesting. Not a standard theatrical supplier's mark. It appears to be... Yes, I believe it's a stylized double-headed eagle, Russian imperial symbolism, though subtly rendered." The Countess reached for the capsule, which Grantham handed to her after a confirming nod from Holmes. She examined the engraving, her expression tightening. "This is Nikolai's personal mark," she confirmed. "He had it applied to all his custom equipment, a private joke, using the Tsar's symbol while working against the regime." Holmes took back the capsule, returning it to his pocket. "Then we have confirmation of our phantom's identity. The question remains, what is Bezukhov's actual purpose in London? What performance is he preparing for that requires such elaborate preparations? And where is he obtaining the rest of his materials?" Watson added. "The items stolen from the fair vendors are only part of what would be needed." "A valid point, Watson," Holmes agreed. "Mr. Grantham, where in London might one acquire the additional chemicals and compounds you mentioned, particularly calcium carbide in quantity?" Grantham considered the question. "For theatrical purposes, Covent Garden has several suppliers. For industrial quantities, there are warehouses in Rotherhithe that supply mining operations and large-scale construction. And of course, certain university laboratories might have access." "The Rotherhithe warehouses are worth investigating," Holmes decided. "They're within easy reach of the Thames, and would provide the privacy needed for experimenting with such compounds." The Countess had moved to examine the masks hanging on Grantham's wall, her attention drawn to one in particular, a smooth, white oval, lacking any features. "This," she said, pointing to it. "This is similar to what he's using." Grantham nodded. "A blank reflection mask, designed to catch and redirect light, making the wearer's face appear as nothing more than a featureless glow when properly illuminated. Effective for creating a ghostly appearance, particularly on ice where light reflects from below as well as above." "How long would it take to create such a mask?" Holmes asked. "The basic form, not long. A few hours for a skilled craftsman," Grantham replied. "But the proper application of the reflective compounds takes longer to cure properly. At least 2 days for optimal effect." "Suggesting our phantom had this prepared well in advance of the Thames freezing," Holmes noted. "This was not an opportunistic series of events, but a planned operation timed to coincide with the Frost Fair." The Countess had grown increasingly tense as the conversation progressed. "We must act quickly, Mr. Holmes. If Nikolai is planning what I suspect, a diversion using these theatrical effects to cover a more serious crime. Then, the culmination is likely to occur tonight. The third night of a frost fair has traditional significance in Russian folklore. It's when the ice spirits are said to be at their most powerful. Folklore seems an odd concern for a former political operative, Watson observed. Nikolai was always as much an artist as an agent, the Countess replied. He incorporated such symbolism into his operations, partly as personal superstition, partly as another layer of misdirection. Observers would dismiss such patterns as coincidence or imagination. Holmes had been silent, his expression distant, in the way that Watson recognized as his deepest thinking mode. Now he focused again on their surroundings, his decision apparently made. "Mr. Grantham, I may require your expertise again before this case concludes," he said. "Please remain available this evening should we need to consult you further." "Of course, Mr. Holmes," the artificer replied. "I'll be closing this temporary workshop at sunset, but I'll be at my regular establishment in Covent Garden thereafter." As they stepped back out onto the ice, the afternoon sun had begun its early winter descent, casting long shadows across the fair. The crowds remained substantial, apparently determined to enjoy this rare spectacle for as long as possible before darkness fell. "We have approximately 4 hours before sunset," Holmes observed. "Time enough to investigate the Rotherhithe warehouses and prepare for tonight's likely confrontation." "And if we find Bezukov before his performance?" Watson asked. Holmes glanced at the Countess, whose face remained carefully composed. "That," he said, "will depend on what exactly we discover about his intentions. Some performances deserve to be interrupted before they begin. Others may need to commence before their true purpose becomes clear." The Countess nodded slightly, a gesture of professional understanding rather than emotional agreement. "Lead on, Mr. Holmes. The ice awaits, and night approaches more quickly than we might wish." The Thames lay transformed under the silver glow of a nearly full moon. By day, the Frost Fair had been a riot of colour and noise, a celebration of London's unexpected winter kingdom. By night, it became something altogether more mysterious, a silent city of shadows and light, where the boundaries between the ordinary and the extraordinary seemed to blur with every passing hour. Holmes, Watson, and the Countess had returned to the fair shortly after sunset. Having spent the intervening hours investigating the Rotherhithe warehouses Holmes had identified as potential sources for the Phantom's chemical supplies. Their search had proven fruitful, yielding confirmation that a man matching Bezukov's description had indeed purchased substantial quantities of calcium carbide and various metal salts within the past week. More troublingly, they had also discovered evidence of a significant purchase of blasting powder, a detail that had visibly concerned Holmes and caused the Countess's carefully maintained composure to slip momentarily. Industrial explosives have no place in theatrical performances, she had observed quietly as they left the warehouse district, her words hanging in the cold air between them. Now, positioned strategically near the center of the fair, the three waited in the deepening cold of night. The crowds had thinned considerably as the temperature dropped, though a surprising number of revellers remained, drawn perhaps by the rumours of the mysterious phantom that now circulated widely through London. Many of the vendors had closed their stalls, but those selling hot drinks and spirits did a brisk trade, their lanterns creating pools of warm light on the darkened ice. Holmes had selected their vantage point with characteristic care, a position that offered clear sight lines to most of the fair, while allowing them to remain relatively inconspicuous among the shadows of a large refreshment tent. All three wore skates, prepared for swift movement across the ice should the need arise. "The Russian will have changed his pattern tonight," Holmes remarked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The small thefts were merely preparation. Whatever his true purpose, it will manifest in this evening's performance. "He favours midnight," the Countess noted, her eyes continuously scanning the fair. "A theatrical choice, as much as a practical one. Nikolai always had a flair for dramatic timing." Watson stamped his feet gently against the cold, grateful for the extra pair of woolen socks Holmes had insisted he wear. "And you still maintain that his purpose here goes beyond simple theft or performance?" "Nikolai abandoned simple performances years ago," she replied. "Everything he does serves multiple purposes. The visible spectacle merely disguises the actual operation." Holmes had been unusually quiet throughout the evening, his keen mind clearly processing and reprocessing the facts they had gathered. Now he spoke with the quiet certainty that Watson knew signalled a breakthrough in his reasoning. "It's not the fair itself that's his target," Holmes said. "That's why the pattern of his movements seemed inconsistent. He's using the fair as a means rather than an end. The ice is his true medium." The Countess turned to him sharply. "What do you mean?" "The Thames," Holmes explained, "provides access to locations normally separated by security measures or physical barriers. When frozen, it creates new pathways, as the watermen at Wapping explained to us. Our Phantom isn't interested in the trinkets, or even the crowds of the Frost Fair. He's interested in what lies beside the Thames." Understanding dawned in Watson's eyes. "The buildings along the riverfront." "Precisely," Holmes confirmed, "and specifically, I suspect, one building whose security relies heavily on its riverside location normally being inaccessible." The Countess's expression changed subtly, a tightening around the eyes that suggested Holmes had confirmed something she already suspected. "The Diplomatic Archive Repository," she said quietly, "on the north bank, just beyond Blackfriars." Holmes nodded. "An unassuming building that houses copies of diplomatic correspondence deemed too sensitive for the main Foreign Office, but too potentially useful to destroy entirely. Normally approachable only from the street side, where guards are posted, or by river, where the water itself provides a natural barrier." "Except when the river freezes," Watson concluded, "creating a backdoor approach. The repository contains evidence of certain arrangements between European powers," the Countess said carefully. "Documents that could prove explosive in the current political climate if they became public, or if they fell into the hands of those seeking to destabilize the balance of power." "Such as Russian revolutionary elements," Holmes suggested, watching her reaction closely. "Or those pretending to serve such elements while pursuing their own agenda," she countered. "Nikolai's loyalty has always been primarily to himself and his art. The politics are secondary, a framework for his performances rather than a true cause." A distant church bell began to toll the quarter hour. 15 minutes until midnight. The remaining fairgoers had gathered in loose clusters around the areas still serving refreshments, or showcasing the few entertainers hardy enough to perform in the intensifying cold. The ice seemed to creak and whisper beneath them, the entire frozen river alive with subtle sounds that carried clearly in the still night air. "He'll approach from the south bank," the Countess predicted. "It's his preferred direction, allows him to build speed before becoming visible to observers." Holmes nodded in agreement. "And he'll use the phantom persona one final time, not for petty theft, but as a diversion to draw attention and potentially security resources away from his actual target. Then we should position ourselves between his likely approach path and the repository," Watson suggested. "Not yet," Holmes cautioned. "First, we need to observe his initial appearance. Pattern of his movement will confirm his intentions before we intercept him." They didn't have long to wait. As the bell rang midnight, a curious hush fell over the fair, as if the remaining revellers collectively held their breath in anticipation. Then, from the direction of Southwark Bridge, a figure appeared, gliding across the ice with the same unnatural smoothness they had witnessed the previous night. The phantom moved with greater speed now, the flowing black cloak billowing behind the tall, slender form like dark water. The blank white mask caught the moonlight, reflecting it in a way that made the face appear to glow with an eerie, internal light. "There," the Countess breathed, an unmistakable note of recognition in her voice. Unlike previous nights, the phantom made no pretense of stealth. It moved directly toward the center of the fair, where the largest cluster of people had gathered. Revellers turned to watch its approach, some backing away in alarm, others pressing forward in fascination. The mysterious figure executed a perfect circuit of the central area, moving with such fluid grace that even Holmes raised an eyebrow in reluctant admiration. "Extraordinary control," he murmured. "The specialized skates allow for movements impossible with conventional equipment." "It was always his gift," the Countess replied, her eyes never leaving the phantom. "The ability to move as if gravity were merely a suggestion rather than a law." Having completed its circuit to the gasps and exclamations of the onlookers, the phantom came to an abrupt halt at the center of the clear area. With theatrical precision, it reached into its flowing cloak and withdrew several small metallic objects, similar to the smoke capsule Holmes had recovered, but larger. "He's beginning the diversion," Holmes said tensely. "We must move now." But before they could leave their position, the phantom cast the devices onto the ice around it. They detonated with surprising force, sending plumes of colored smoke billowing upward, crimson, emerald, and silver clouds that expanded rapidly in the cold air. The effect was stunning, drawing cries of amazement from the crowd, who clearly believed they were witnessing a planned performance. As the smoke spread, concealing much of the central fair, Holmes led them swiftly along the edge of the ice, skirting the growing confusion. The Countess moved with remarkable speed and balance, her skates barely seeming to touch the surface as she kept pace with Holmes's rapid progress. Watson followed, grateful for the Dutch skates Holmes had insisted they wear, which provided superior stability and control compared to the English varieties. "He'll use the north edge of the smoke cloud as cover," Holmes predicted, as they cut across an empty section of the fair. "Moving diagonally toward the repository while all eyes are fixed on the spectacle." Sure enough, as they rounded a shuttered vendor's stall, Watson caught a glimpse of a black-clad figure emerging from the edge of the multicolored smoke, now moving with purposeful speed toward the north bank. The phantom had abandoned the theatrical gliding movement, adopting instead a powerful, efficient stroke that rapidly increased the distance between it and the confused crowd. "There," Watson called, pointing. Holmes immediately adjusted their course to intercept the fleeing figure. The Countess accelerated, drawing ahead with a burst of speed that demonstrated why she had once been a champion. The Phantom, Bezukov, spotted their approach and changed direction, heading now toward a darker section of the riverbank, where the Diplomatic Archive repository stood in shadow, its riverside entrance normally protected by the Thames itself. "He has something strapped to his back," the Countess called over her shoulder, "a satchel or pack of some kind." "The explosives," Holmes replied grimly, pushing himself faster. They were gaining ground, but Bezukov's head start and extraordinary skill made the pursuit challenging. He moved across the ice with machine-like precision, each stroke perfectly balanced and efficient. As they closed the distance to within 50 yards, he suddenly scattered a handful of small objects onto the ice behind him. "Take care," Holmes warned sharply. "Glass caltrops, they'll shred our blades if we hit them." They were forced to veer widely around the hazard, losing precious seconds. Bezukov used the delay to reach the darkened embankment where the repository building loomed. With a powerful leap, he cleared the narrow gap between ice and stone, landing on a maintenance platform typically submerged beneath the Thames. The platform provided access to a heavy iron door, the repository's waterside entrance, designed for boat deliveries during normal river conditions. "He'll use a shaped charge on that door," the Countess called as they raced to close the remaining distance. "Standard procedure for this type of operation." Watson, drawing on his military experience, recognized the danger immediately. "Holmes, if he detonates explosives that close to the ice, it could crack the entire section. We'd be plunged into the water beneath." Holmes nodded grimly. "Which may be part of his escape plan, creating chaos that would make pursuit impossible." They reached the embankment just as Bezukov was removing the satchel from his back. The Phantom turned to face them, the blank mask revealing nothing of the man behind it. For a moment, all four figures were frozen in tableau. Bezukov on the platform with his back to the repository door, Holmes, Watson, and the Countess spread in a semicircle on the ice before him. "It's over, Nikolai," the Countess called, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Whatever you're seeking in the repository isn't worth what will follow." The masked figure remained motionless for several heartbeats. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached up and removed the blank white mask, revealing the face they had seen in the photograph, older now, lined with experience and perhaps hardship, but undeniably the same man. His eyes, surprisingly gentle in such a hard face, fixed on the Countess. "Irina," he said, his voice carrying the subtle cadence of his Russian origins, despite flawless English pronunciation. "I wondered when you would find me, though I didn't expect you to bring such distinguished company." He inclined his head slightly toward Holmes and Watson. "Put down the satchel, Bezukov," Holmes said calmly. "Whatever documents you're seeking, the game has ended." A smile touched the Russian's lips. "Games end, Mr. Holmes. Art endures. And this—" He gestured to encompass the frozen Thames, the distant fair, and their confrontation. "This is my finest performance." "A performance that will end with your arrest if you proceed," Holmes warned. Bezukov shook his head slightly. "You misunderstand my purpose, detective. I'm not here to steal documents." He patted the satchel. "This contains no explosives, merely the tools needed to open a very specific safe inside the repository. A safe containing evidence that certain British officials have been selling diplomatic secrets to both Russian and German interests simultaneously. The Countess's expression changed subtly. The Havisham correspondence. Precisely, Bezukov confirmed. Documents that would embarrass your current employers greatly, Irina, should they become public. Which is why you're really here. Not to apprehend a phantom, but to ensure those papers never see daylight. Holmes glanced briefly at the Countess, whose composed facade had finally cracked to reveal a complex mixture of emotions. "You're working for British intelligence," he said. "Not a question, but a confirmation." She met his gaze steadily. "Among others. Nikolai isn't the only one who found new employment after our previous lives ended." Bezukov laughed softly. "We're not so different, you and I. Both performing for new masters while remembering the art that once defined us." "The difference," she replied coldly, "is that I don't endanger innocent lives with theatrical diversions on thin ice." Something flickered in Bezukov's eyes, perhaps regret or merely calculation. He set the satchel down slowly on the platform. "The ice would have held. I tested it thoroughly, as I test all my performance elements. No one was ever in danger. Except those whose careers and possibly lives would be ruined by the exposure of these documents," Holmes observed. "Men who made their own choices, Mr. Holmes," Bezukov countered. "Men who betrayed their country for profit while pretending to serve it. Do they not deserve exposure?" Before Holmes could respond, a sharp crack echoed across the ice, not from Bezukov's position, but from the direction of the fair. All four turned to look. In the distance, flashes of light and billowing smoke suggested that something had gone wrong with the diversionary display Bezukov had created. "Secondary detonations," Watson said with alarm. "The chemical compounds are reacting unexpectedly." Bezukov's confident expression faltered. "Impossible. I calculated every element precisely." "You calculated for normal conditions?" Holmes replied sharply. "Not for the extreme cold of this exceptional frost. The chemical reactions are accelerated by the temperature differential when exposed to air." Even as he spoke, more cracks sounded from the ice near the central fair. Distant shouts suggested panic was spreading among the remaining revelers. The ice beneath their own feet trembled slightly, a sensation that sent a chill through Watson, unrelated to the bitter cold. "The ice is fracturing," he warned. "The vibrations from the explosions are creating stress patterns across the entire frozen section." Bezukov stared at the distant fair, genuine horror replacing his previously confident demeanor. "That wasn't supposed to happen. My diversions were calculated to be harmless, theatrical only." "Your calculations failed," the Countess said tersely, "as they did once before, in St. Petersburg." Something like pain crossed Bezukov's face at her words. He seemed about to respond when a much louder crack rented the air, this one from directly beneath them. The ice near the embankment shuddered visibly, and a thin line appeared, running from the platform where Bezukov stood toward the fair. "We need to move away from the embankment," Holmes said urgently. "The confined space between stone and ice creates a pressure point." Bezukov hesitated only briefly before abandoning both his satchel and his mission. With the grace that had made him legendary, he leapt from the platform back onto the ice, landing beside the Countess. "We'll need to move together," he said, all pretense of their adversarial relationship temporarily set aside. "The ice will be most stable if we distribute our weight and move in synchronization." Holmes nodded, recognizing the expertise in Bezukhov's assessment. "Lead us, then. You know this surface better than anyone." Under Bezukhov's guidance, they began moving away from the embankment in a diamond formation, maintaining precise distances between them. The Russian's expert knowledge of ice movement was immediately apparent. He led them along paths that appeared identical to the surrounding surface, but somehow felt more solid beneath their skates. "The Thames current runs stronger in certain channels," he explained as they moved, creating variations in the ice thickness that are invisible to the casual observer but detectable to those who know what to feel for. The distant commotion at the fair was growing, with more flashes of light visible, and the sounds of cracking ice more frequent. They had covered perhaps half the distance back to the main fairground, when a series of sharp reports, like gunshots but deeper in tone, echoed across the river. "The main sheet is separating," Bezukov warned, his voice tense. "We need to reach stable ice before—" His words were cut short as a massive crack appeared directly ahead of them, running perpendicular to their path. The ice on either side began to shift slightly, not enough to plunge them into the water below, but sufficient to create a widening gap that would soon become impassable. "This way," Holmes called, veering sharply toward Blackfriars Bridge, where the ice appeared to be holding more firmly around the massive stone pillars. They changed direction as one, moving with increasing urgency. The Countess and Bezukov demonstrated their extraordinary skill, practically flying across the increasingly treacherous surface. Holmes matched their pace with surprising agility, for someone self-taught, while Watson followed with the steady determination that had carried him through Afghan battlefields. They had nearly reached the relative safety of the bridge when a final, devastating crack split the night. The ice behind them gave way with a sound like thunder, creating a channel of black water that expanded rapidly in their direction. The Phantom's final performance had turned deadly, the Thames reclaiming its liquid state in violent protest against its frozen imprisonment. "Sprint!" Bezukov shouted, abandoning their careful formation. "The bridge pillar! Reach the bridge pillar!" The four skaters made a final desperate push toward the massive stone foundation of Blackfriars Bridge. The water was gaining on them, the ice disintegrating in a chain reaction that threatened to swallow them before they could reach safety. Watson felt his legs burning with effort, his lungs painful in the bitter cold as he pushed beyond what he believed himself capable of. Holmes reached the pillar first, turning immediately to extend his hand toward Watson, who was falling slightly behind. The Countess arrived seconds later, pivoting gracefully to face back toward the approaching water. Bezukov, despite his extraordinary skill, had drifted slightly off course, placing him in the direct path of the rapidly approaching break. "Nikolai!" the Countess called, extending her hand toward him. Bezukov made a final powerful thrust, reaching for her outstretched fingers. For a moment, it seemed he would make it, his hand almost touching hers. Then the ice beneath him gave way with a sickening crack, and he plunged into the black water of the awakening Thames. The Countess lunged forward, only Holmes's quick reflexes preventing her from following Bezukov into the frigid current. For several terrible seconds, there was no sign of the fallen skater. Then, perhaps 10 yards downstream, his head broke the surface, gasping for air amidst the shifting ice flows. "The current!" Watson shouted. "It's carrying him under the bridge." Without hesitation, Holmes stripped off his heavy coat and passed Watson his pocket watch and wallet. "Get the Countess to shore," he instructed, tersely. "I'll attempt to reach him at the next pillar." Before Watson could protest, Holmes had set off, skating parallel to the expanding channel of water, tracking Bezukhov's struggling form as the current pulled him inexorably downstream. The Countess moved to follow, but Watson caught her arm firmly. "We must reach shore," he insisted. "You can do nothing for him in the water, but everything if we alert the emergency services." For a moment, she looked as if she might fight him. Then, professional calculation replaced emotion, and she nodded once, sharply. "The south bank is closer. There's a police station near the bridge." Together, they navigated toward shore, picking their way across ice that continued to groan and shift beneath them. Behind them, Holmes had disappeared from view, following the bridge line in pursuit of the man who had been, until moments ago, their quarry. As they finally reached the solid ground of the embankment, Watson turned to look back at the Thames. What had been a magical frozen kingdom hours earlier was now a chaotic jumble of breaking ice and swirling currents. The Frost Fair was in disarray, though thankfully most participants appeared to have reached safety. Of Holmes and Bezukov there was no sign, only the dark water of the Thames, reclaiming its domain beneath the cold light of the winter moon. That's our story tonight. Are you drifting off beneath the golden lights of Barcelona, the misty calm of Vancouver, the tranquil shores of Bora Bora, or the moonlit beauty of Prague? If this tale brought you peace, like the episode and subscribe for more nights like this. Let the silence cradle you. Let your dreams drift far across the night. Sleep gently now, wherever you are in this wide and wondrous world.